there seemed to be an attitude, if you had enough firepower and foul language, that the enemy would sort of buckle at the knees and ask for forgiveness and surrender. The Vietnamese had more in them than that, that's for sure.
You said the worst thing is looking for mines.
Mm.
How do you actually look for mines? Is there a lump on the ground or...?
Nah. I think the way you find out you're on mines is when somebody's stepped on one. I mean, the M16 mine had 3 metal prongs, no larger than sort of, the diameter of, say, just 3 wire prongs, and they just had to be, have a leaf over the top and you wouldn't know. As soon as the boot came off the mine would lift into the air at about chest height and then detonate, and terrible injuries. I mean, it's very strange to be sort of sitting down there and Frank has got an unloaded but cocked M16 and you got the barrel in your mouth and the front side about here on your nose, and he blows a shot up through the barrel of this bloody M16. I mean, it's a bit odd.
Did that actually happen?
Oh yes, that happened. Yeah, shotgunning. I think it was quite popular amongst the Yanks at the time. Because you were seen as the instrument of government policy. You were being told straight to your face it was a mistake, it was a civil war. As far as I'm concerned, I'd already worked that out through bitter experience, not as a sort of a first year politics at La Trobe University exercise. My name is Vaughan Millar. I was born in Glenhuntly, Victoria in 1948 on the 1st of November. I was 17 years of age. I went straight into the army, trained at Kabuka at 1RTB, was allocated to the artillery. I went to School of Artillery at North Head, then on to 131 Divisional Lock Battery at Holsworthy. From Holsworthy I went to Vietnam in 1967, returned to Australia in 1968 and was discharged from the Army in 1969.
Now, can you tell us about the 131st Divisional Locating Battery?
Locating Battery, 131 Div Lock Battery is the short. It's a small battery, and it's sort of, I think it had its roots somewhere in the First World War, and somebody noted that you can, if you have people looking what they call flash spotters, and then when you can see a flash of a gun in the distance, or in fact a mortar or whatever have you, you see the flash and you count the seconds elapse from time to flash to bang, you can get actually the distance it is from you. If you have people at various bearings watching the same flash, you can actually take an angle to where the flash is, so you actually get a bearing or an angle to the flash, and then plus the distance, and where you have 2 lines or 2 observations intersecting, you're pretty close to the mark of where the actual initiation of the flash may have occurred. 131 had several sections as part of its battery makeup. It had the listening posts, it had a survey section. I think it also had a meteorological section, but I've forgotten. I may not be 100% right on that. It had what they call an artillery intelligence section, and it had a headquarter section, and it had a radar section for mortar locating radar. And 131 was based at Holsworthy in part of the, I think, Gallipoli or Kokoda barracks at Holsworthy. And after I did my artillery training at North Head, I was sent to 131, and that's where I spent my time in the army.
When you got to Nui Dat, I guess you were basically straight away into it.
No, and yes, I suppose is the answer. Look, I'll start off with one of the things that I found, and I still look back in retrospect, that I found that my experiences in a war zone were for me, I would consider relatively ordinary. Yeah, I wasn't a grunt in that. I wasn't, dashing up and down, as an assault pioneer, Lord help them, or in tanks. I've always thought I was very lucky, fortunate, and generally a fairly pedestrian tour of duty, so to speak. One of the things that I sort of mentioned when I said about being ordinary, in retrospect, which is a handy thing to do, I try to compare what was ordinary for me there and blokes I went to school with who stayed here in Australia, and it really is really quite different than where you sort of set the yardstick at being ordinary. And arriving at Nui Dat, Pale and everybody else had been there, so they had time, got time. And one of the things that you learnt as soon as you arrived there is how short you were or how long you were. And to arrive in country with 365 and a wakey to go, you realise that you had a bit of time to put in. We were picked up at Lushcombe Airstrip after getting off the maybe a 20-minute flight or in the Caribou, all very excited, and we were picked up by one of the drivers and delivered to our battery headquarters in Nui Dat. Set our gear down, and then we went to, then we were issued with weapons. And I sort of found that interesting. And I was, for some reason, issued with an M16, and I think it was either 10 or 20 magazines with real ammunition, full kit of webbing. And then after that, we went to our battery headquarter area, our club, and we were being given an orders group or an orientation of where we were going, what the rules were inside Nui Dat. And it was, I think this orientation had been going about 5 minutes, where I had my first experience of being switched on. While our battery captain was sort of talking like this, we were only about 100 metres from one of the regimental gun batteries, and they fired a mission. No warning. All of a sudden, these 6 guns went bang all at once, and he didn't flinch. And I nearly jumped out of my skin, and he just kept talking, and then just quite offhandedly said, they're just firing a mission. And what I sort of found interestingly, a few weeks later, the guns could go off behind me, and I wouldn't flinch at all, which I think had its own impact in many, in its own way. And so here we were in Nui Dat. I was sent down to a listening post called 31 Charlie, and the setup for 131 battery at Nui Dat is that they had a series of listening posts at various positions around the task force. 31 Alpha, which was probably the premier listening post, was right on top of Nui Dat Hill, up there on the SAS lines. You had a 360, well, we used mills in those zones. You had a 6400 vista of the surrounding countryside. 31 Bravo had a similar vista, but that was about 8 clicks away at the Horseshoe. And then you had 31 Charlie, which was down at 21 Construction Squadron, which was looking out into a small valley on one side of the task force. And you had 31 Delta, which is about 600 metres down the road at an American artillery battalion. I think they were the 181st to the 83rd, I think, artillery battalion, and these were a self-propelled unit of 8-inch SP guns and things like that, and 31 Delta was down there. And TAC headquarters was right in the middle of the task force at the area, at TAC HQ, Nui Dat. And these LPs were cited that if there was any contacts, movement, detonations, explosions, you could get a good range of bearings from the various observations, and these would be radioed in to your tactical headquarters, and you had a plotting board in there, which was fully surveyed in, and you just using a pencil and a ruler took the bearings from each of the observations, and where the lines intersected, essentially that was the target. And I went down to 3-1 Charlie there at the engineers, which didn't have a particularly good view. It was just a place to sort of start you off and learn the procedures, and then start to learn how to live on a sleep deprived diet. Sleeping was always a problem. LPs were generally made up of about 5 blokes, and I was in charge. I was a Lance Bombardier by the time I arrived at Vietnam, which made me a very young Lance Bombardier amongst blokes who were generally 2 years older than me because they were national servicemen. And what would happen, the day routine was pretty mundane, pretty boring. How they say in the crudity, shower and shampoo, clean your weapon, go to breakfast, these sorts of things. But it was at night time where our unit more or less became alive, so to speak. And what we would do is that as soon as stand to or stand down would occur in the evening, and in the tropics, about 6 o'clock, it gets dark. 7 o'clock, it's very dark. There's very little variation there of long twilights or long dawns. And you would do a 3-hour radio shift inside one of these LPs. And the LPs had generally 2 radio sets, a landmine, machine gun, rocket launcher, the odd hand grenade, Playboy magazines, the usual detritus, of war. And your first shift after stand to would be 7 till 10. Then your next shift would be 10 to 1, 1 till 4, 4 till 7. And you used to rotate and move on one shift per man per night. So if you had 5 people there, every 5th day, one person would get a night off. And then you'd start up again. So each night, it's all right if you're in a relatively quiet position. You weren't getting to bed until, say, 10 o'clock at night or 1 in the morning, and that 1 till 4 was an absolute killer shift, because when you went out into the scrub, you always had stand to, and the Australian Army was ritualised on stand to, which is half an hour before dawn, everybody is awake, rifle at the ready, in your pet, looking into the front, until half an hour after. Everybody did that. And so if you've been awake from 4 o'clock in the morning, it's not too bad. But if you've only got to bed, or bed, I use the term advisedly, at 4 o'clock, and then you've got to be up for stand 2, and then the day's events and things like that, it sort of really played havoc on your circadian rhythms. I'd been at 3-1 Charlie for a short period of time, and one of the things to explain, I suppose, about 131, we were a detachment, so it wasn't a very large unit. I'm not even too sure what the manning numbers were, maybe 80, maybe 110, I really don't know. But we were each other's replacement. I went and replaced somebody who was coming home, and there were only, I think, about 4 other of us on the flight. So there were very small dribs and drab replacements, unlike the battalions who came in as a battalion, served as a battalion, went home as a battalion, hopefully, where we just sort of went there and basically served our own particular time until our own replacement came in, and you never met them, and then you came back to Australia. I went down to the Americans for a short stint down at 3-1 Delta to take over the LP there, and this was coming up to Christmas 1967, and it was my first taste of a little bit of combat and the Americans, and also what firepower is all about, and having your sensibility shattered, at very odd times. The LP there was quite a heavily fortified bunker, looking out over dead ground, barbed wire, but towards the village of Hoa Long, which was down to one side of the task force. And I can remember on one of my first shifts in the in the LP at 3-1 Delta. I was sort of sitting up there. Now these 8-inch self-propelled guns fired an extremely heavy charge to a distance, depending on what charge they were, shell they were on, they could fire up to 32 kilometres. And part of the ballistics, if they were firing at a high angle, you had to calculate the rotation of the Earth. I mean, these were significantly serious artillery pieces. And if they were firing on a supercharge or a high charge, you got several bangs that went. You had the actual detonation of the shell passing through the barrel of the weapon, and then because of the velocity of the shell, it then broke the sound barrier. So you got these things. I remember sitting up there at night, and all of a sudden this huge detonation going off behind me, and it was these guns firing a mission straight over the top of the LP, and thinking, gee, I wonder what that is. One of the things that occurred, you had what they call H&I, which is short for harassing and interdiction fire. Because I didn't have a radio connected to the American regimental net and also the artillery regimental net, I never knew when a fire mission was coming up. So you could get a bit of a surprise that all of a sudden, these guns would start firing in your direction, but luckily over the top of your head. So that was... you always kept an ear out for when the Americans started moving around in their own base. And I was there just before Christmas. I was sitting up there, I think it was around about 9:30, quarter to 10 at night, and all of a sudden about 5 to 10 rounds of small arms automatic fire came in my direction from outside the fire, firing in, so it was incoming, not outgoing, and it hit the sandbags around me, and I then learnt what sort of damage that a high velocity 7.62 short round from an AK-47 could do. If that did that to a sandbag, what it would do to skin and bone was, would be really quite substantial. And I can remember radioing in, getting permission to return fire, which I think was a bit of bravado on my behalf rather than anything else, and being told no, that couldn't happen because there was a truce for Christmas. So just sort of got down behind the thickest bits of the sandbags and sort of waited out for my shift to finish, which was a couple of hours later, and that was about my introduction into the life and times of Nui Dat and my first Christmas overseas.
It was also your first encounter with the enemy?
At a distance.
How far was the enemy?
I have no. Well, how far was way along? It was only about 100, 200 metres, just across on the other side of the barbed wire. But whoever let loose that, I don't even know if that burst was even aimed at me. I've got no idea about that. It just came in. That's all. And this particular LP, being Americans who are very techno orientated, it had a seismograph inside it. And there were sensors outside the other side of the wire, which was supposed to be sensitive enough to pick up footfalls, and you could isolate these various microphones out there to give you a rough idea where things were happening. That may be fine in theory, but Vietnam is full of snakes and full of mongooses, and it'd be these sort of mammals and reptiles sort of coming to grips with each other at night, and all your seismographs would be going off, and things like that. And we had a thing called starlight scopes, and this is the rudimentary night vision technology coming on stream, where the starlight scope was operated by a couple of D-cell batteries, but it would gather any ambient or available light, magnify it, and you got this strange shimmering green image in the pitch black. I could never really work out what I was looking at anyway at the night. The food was appalling. The fresh water always tasted of rubber. And the milk generally was injected with some sort of preservative which tasted like ether, and the eggs were made of rubber. Yeah.
Now, you were talking about the Americans before as well.
Yeah.
What was the general view of the Americans with the Australian army?
I think we thought they were a bit of a joke, really. Poor discipline. Yeah. And somewhere to be a long way away from rather than close to. Except, of course, for their Air Force and their helicopters, who was seen as, that sort of heavyweight firepower comes in very handy. But the way Americans organised themselves, their security discipline and all that was very poor indeed. And I had one example of it. I was actually out in a fire support base where this American unit came in, and I was talking to a GI, and he was carrying an M14, which was an equivalent weapon to our SLR. It was a 7.62 long round. And I can remember asking if I could sort of, examine the weapon. He wanted to have a look at an M16 or something like that. And first thing you do when you sort of pick up a weapon, you make the weapon safe. It's a handy thing to do. And the procedure of making a weapon safe, if you don't know what it is, you take the magazine off and you cock the weapon. And if there's a round up the spout, it should pop out, and there's no mag there. I can remember forcing the magazine off this M14 and finding that the top 2 rounds in there were just encrusted in rust and dirt. And when he sort of looked at mine, he made some sort of comment about it being a mighty clean piece, and I thought, well, your weapon is going to save your life and you keep it clean, functioning. Because an M16s particularly were notorious in those days for misfiring or not firing at all. And I think, and the Americans were not trained for what they were doing. In many ways, I feel very sorry for them that they were, badly informed, and I think very badly trained. I mean, you think about it, and you see it on these popular things. What a helmet! What's the use of having a camouflaged helmet if you've got a packet of Marlboro stuck in one side and the ace of spades stuck in the other? I mean, it just makes a very nice target, doesn't it? And the whole idea of walking through scrub with your sleeves sort of rolled up to some sort of, horny bicep, it just sort of stands out. I mean, I think any sort of action you see of Australians overseas, they'll have their hats on, scarves on, sleeves rolled down, watching their arcs, which is those areas of responsibility when you're moving along in a patrol formation. And the Americans column a blob, noisy, and they used to leave rubbish around. And I try to sort of understand what organisation would allow that sort of neglect of the safety of its own troops. And I felt, I have very mixed feelings about the Americans. 58,000 died, and I would say a lot of those people died because they were inadequately and improperly trained for the job. Big statement. But flying helicopters, or F4 Phantoms, or 105s, fantastic. Just fantastic.
I recall you also saying that they were better to be away from.
I think so.
Why is that?
Because they're noisy. They were just very noisy. And they had no idea about, they didn't demonstrate, and look, I only had limited exposure to the Americans. And the Americans I did have exposure to were essentially artillery. So you said, well, they weren't trained to be infantry. I don't know, but I did see infantry formations moving around me. Helmets, flak jackets, bare chests, so to speak, underneath. Well, I don't know what that's about. And just very noisy. There seemed to be an attitude, if you had enough firepower and foul language, that the enemy would sort of buckle at the knees and ask for forgiveness and surrender. the Vietnamese had more in them than that, that's for sure.
Australians are quite conservative with their use of ammunition, weren't they?
You had to account for it, yeah.
Well, the
Pick up your brass. Don't leave brass lying around. Quite strange, isn't it?
even after a firefight.
Pretty well, yeah. We were told to go and pick up our brass, yeah.
What was the reasoning for that?
Well, it had to be recycled or they could use it. I guess that was the other thing, but I don't know what a piece of brass, 7.62 piece of brass is worth on the scrap market. But, oh no, we didn't have the luxury of the Americans in this regard at all.
Okay, so there's no such thing. The Americans used to do something called a firing patrol.
I don't know what that is.
Well, according to what other Vietnam vets have told us, Australians, that they would actually walk down the road and fire on both sides of the street.
Oh, they sort of a clear fire type thing. Yeah, that was their idea of clearing something. Stand off and open fire. And then they say, well, that's great, you know. And then they'd walk into it and get killed. Yeah. That was not an Australian method at all. At all.
It was designed to trigger potential ambushes.
Oh, according to the American point of view, yeah.
What do you think the disadvantages of those sort of tactics were?
Well,
As far as
it's a waste of ammunition, and you don't unless you can see what you're firing at. I mean, that's the whole thing, you know. Make sure you've got a target. It's no good firing at shadows. It's no good firing where they think you may be. And of course, I mean, from a Vietnamese point of view, once you learn that, all you got to do is sort of make a noise, go boo, and all of a sudden they're expending. And don't forget, if everybody fires at once, say 10 to 20 rounds, there's going to be a lull where they can't do anything because they've got to be changing magazines. Now, the fastest you can change a magazine, let's say 3 seconds, 4 seconds, and things like that. Well, when you're between magazines, you're in a fairly vulnerable sort of state, especially if one person is just sort of waiting for that to happen. And, you know, the Americans were constantly beguiled by the use of, you know, firepower as the answer. And firepower definitely was not the answer. It certainly wasn't. You know, good training, stealth, good discipline, and guile, you know, was you know, got you through. You know, and knowing that you could rely 105% on the bloke who was beside you.
Can you tell us about your first operational experience?
Yes.
Or combat experience?
Yes. First operational experience was gearing up for the Tet Offensive. Went out to, had no idea where we're going, but it was a big move, and went out to a place called Fire Support Base Harrison. And it still gives me the willies when I think about it in retrospect, because Harrison was about the size of a small soccer field in a low, flat valley where left and right was completely enclosed scrub. And we're it, you know, one gun battery, one little detachment 131, one defensive employment platoon, and 2 battalions of infantry spread out around us for about 5,000 metres at various levels. And they were constantly coming into contact with North Vietnamese troops who were either going into Saigon for the Tet Offensive or coming out of Saigon or heading into Bien Hoa for the Tet Offensive. And I was there at Fire Support Base Harrison for a terribly long time. Never fired a shot there, but it was intensely nerve-wracking. Our LP was right there at the perimeter of the wire. It was only a couple of strands of wire between the other side. And at night, I used to get a bit of cigarette paper and place it on one of the barbs on the wire, and that was my limited vision. If that started moving, I knew I wasn't seeing things. And you'd stare out into this each night going on shift, and all day, you know, the guns would be operating, you know, nearly all day. The guns would be operating nearly all night, and you'd be in your LP, you know, as perimeter defence. and we were out there for weeks, and it was a dry season, so washing was out, was not on. You expected to shave each day, but the ability, the luxury of being able to use water for cleaning your teeth and washing certainly wasn't on. And after a little while, it started to stink, and we lived in these holes in the ground. Part of the procedure was that every person was expected to have a minimum of 18 inches of overhead cover in their pit, and all pits were supposed to be L-shaped. So you had an entrance offset at right angles, so if a bomb landed in there, it would blast into the opposite wall and not come into your little sleeping compartment. And your overhead cover would be built up to a height of about 2 foot above ground, with a hoochie slung over the top of that, and you'd have all your little worldly goods in and around that hole, and that was close to your LP, where you'd have your 25 set. Most of the time we had an M60 machine gun there as well as my personal weapon, and you'd start these shifts. And at Harrison there are only 4 of us, so we're doing 3-hour shifts every night, no time off at all. And for some reason we left Harrison. I don't know why. Maybe we won. I don't know. And then we were moved into another fire support base, Anderson, and this was around about February sometime. And it was a fairly long rectangle with one end of the fire support base dominated by a slight rise, and it sort of dropped away to the right, and the perimeter fencing on that was a slight dog leg. And I mention that because it has its own impact on me. And it changed its sort of angle of run, and then it was to the front. There was open ground for about 200 metres or thereabouts, and a tree line running left to right across our operational front. We certainly had there was a battery guns in there, D&E platoon again. Engineers, SIGs, the general odds and sods that you have in fire support bases. And I think it was on the night of the 18th of February or the 19th, it's one or the other. We were attacked by elements of I think North Vietnamese and Viet Cong, even though they had reconnoitred that day, because they had children and people sort of come at me around the front of the fire support base. So I guess they were doing the reconnoitre there. But it opened up, and a friend of mine, Jim Menz, who was also a bombardier, he was killed that night. And also another friend of mine, bloke by the name of Dutchy Van Riel, another bombardier, he was wounded.
Okay, so yes, you were talking about Tet Offensive,
Yes.
and that first when you got attacked, your battery.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Just let me gather my thoughts for a moment. It was about 1 o'clock or there in the morning, and I was deep within my little pit, and I heard the unmistakable detonations, primaries, of a mortar. It's a sort of a coughing type sound, and and these detonations were in a rapid succession. It woke me up or galvanised me immediately. I got out of my pit. I've got to describe these pits. I mean, here you are, 4.5 foot underground. This thing is exactly 6 foot long, which gives me a little bit of room to have my toes down one end. It's sort of elbows at half cock wide. There is no mattress or anything like that, just a ground sheet and a mosquito net in there. And all my kit is webbing rifle is at the entrance of this. So I got out, and as I got up, I could actually see where the mortar was, and it was around about 200 metres to my left front. I'd actually got out there fast enough because the rounds hadn't hit, and I laced my boots up, still had my boots on, sort of laced them up, and dashed down to the LP just as the rounds hit, and they hit the ridge which was behind me, and I think it was in that initial detonation that Jim Menz was killed and Dutchy Van Driel was injured. And then there was a lot of small arms fire happening, a lot of outgoing, a lot of incoming at this of small arms. And I got down to the LP, and lo and behold, Peter Binns, who was a gunner at the time, he's in the pit with somebody else. And so there was no room for, definitely not room for three. And Peter told me to bugger off because there wasn't any room. So I got back to my own pit, got in, and I could still see the mortar firing, and I could actually see people around the mortar with the detonations. And strange things happened. Your brain starts to do things, and it became obvious that I was either going to be involved or not be involved. And to be involved meant that I had to take my weapon off safe and start to open fire on the mortar position, which was to my front. And I can remember hesitating because I thought the moment I do this and I start firing, I'll start drawing attention to myself, which was an erroneous thought, because so I started opening fire. And the way I used to load my magazines is that my second round was always a tracer, and my second last round was always a tracer, so it let me know if I went through a mag, if I fired, when I came to the last tracer, I had one round left and it was time to sort of, change magazines, just to, my own sort of weapon peculiarity. I don't know if other blokes did it, but that's the way I did it. And I can remember opening fire, and I can remember the first tracer round sort of, heading out in the direction of the mortar, and it hit a berm or a bund or something, and it sort of skyrocketed straight into the air, and I think it was about 50 metres short, quite short of what I was shooting at, and then I just started firing rounds into the mortar position, and by the time that the last tracer round on that magazine was used, I was more or less pretty well on target, and I just kept putting magazine after magazine in that direction. Meanwhile, things really started to escalate quite significantly. There was fire all up and down the perimeter. I could actually, from time to time, see groups of people moving to my front, but I couldn't actually fire at them because it would have been firing over the top or through the LP down, in front of me, which is not quite what you want to do. And to my right, and slightly in advance of me, there was an infanterian in there, and he had an M60, and he was firing, sustained bursts of M60 into this sort of open ground, into the front of the fire support base. Don't know how long this went on for. It was really difficult because I was excited. I was certainly switched on. There was no doubt about that, and really felt quite a great degree of inner calm. And it was about either being involved or not involved, and I'd sort of crossed that very definite line, and sort of made things all right, so to speak. Very shortly after these flares, I don't know where the fire missions were coming from, but there were certainly artillery delivered flares, and the gunships started to arrive, and they were moving up and down the front of the fire support base, just raking fire. And it really is a spectacular and exciting sort of thing, this whole sort of deadly scenario, the symphony of the sort of the sounds of miniguns, and you just get this wall of tracer fire, just sort of, and this sort of rippling sort of farting sound, it just sort of plows it down. And this was happening, and part of my mind thought, gee, on the last pass that helicopter came a bit close. And it came, and they were flying missions just running parallel. And as I said earlier, the perimeter fence was at a slight dogleg. And at the lower dogleg, if you took a line, it actually passed, and if you continued on past that line in the dog, it actually went up through my pit, so to speak, and continued on to the top, over the top. And after a couple more passes, and then I realised that the helicopter was overflying the line of the perimeter. And I looked up and looked around, and at the same time probably gave the most important order I'd ever given in my army life, and it was to this infantry who had the M60, because he had realised that the helicopter was overflying. It was still firing, and it was the side gunner was firing down into our area, and he yelled something and started to raise the M60 to fire at the helicopter. And I yelled the order stop, which is an artillery order, and fortunately he did. But at the same time, the helicopter just overflew, and I looked up and I saw this stream of tracer, come towards me where I was, standing and leaning over the top of my pit, and this, how will I say, this curtain of bullets just fell to the ground around me and didn't touch me. And I looked up again, and the helicopter seemed to be just suspended in the air above me, and then it just did a flyaway turn, banked left and disappeared, and dumped all the cartridge cases onto my head. And I looked around, and that was it. And it was all sort of strangely normal again, and I hadn't been touched, except for a couple of empties down the back of my shirt.
Pretty narrow shave. It's as narrow as they come.
It was pretty close, yeah. And it happened. It was a paradoxical thing. They talk about your senses get a bit suspended. Time gets a bit suspended. This wouldn't have lasted any more than, say, 3 seconds. I don't think any longer than that. But it seemed to be a strangely longer time than that, and it was pitch black apart from the flares going off, and it just sort of jinked away, and that was that. And I sort of sat down in the back of my pit and sort of took no further action. I didn't fire another round after that. But we stood to. At dawn, the attacks seemed to die away, disappear, and I spent a lot of time trying to work out what had just happened to me, and probably spent about 2.5 hours trying to work that out. And after stand down, went up to where our battery lines were, and I was asked to be part of a detail to clean up some of Jim's kit and things like that. And it was obvious, his body was gone, and so was Dutchy Vandriel. But it was, quite obvious that he, suffered, judging by the tissue and blood and things like that. It was quite odd, sort of picking bits and pieces up and sort of popping it into a sandbag, and that got flown out. And that was that, really. And it was sort of gone by the morning. And I can remember I don't even remember talking to people about it. I didn't know, who the grunt was, who had the M60. Peter Binns, was otherwise occupied to things that happened because there were bodies out front. And there'd been a lot of, rockets and things like that flying around, and I just thought, this is very strange indeed, and that's the way it was. And I think the next day or that day, the first elements of the Centurion tanks arrived at Fire Support Base Anderson, and one of the tanks was commanded by an old family friend, Kevin Gurney, who had come up from Nui Dat, I think 3 Battalion, who had arrived from very intense fighting around Baria, had also arrived. And I don't have very much memory of events after that, except to say that was in February, and I was still out in the sticks well into March, and moved on to another fire support base. And one of one of the things that have sort of stayed with me from that conflict, we moved into this, it was a temporary, and you've seen the photographs of those guns there, red soil. I've got no idea where that is or how long we were there, but we had just arrived in and the guns were being set up. There was no barbed wire or anything there, and I can remember there was a Chinook helicopter bringing in another 105, and this sergeant sort of pointed to me and telling me to come with him, and sat me down next to a tree and then said, now keep an eye out for snipers. And I thought, well, well, I hope I pick it. I hope I pick the sniper before he picks me. And I wonder what the idea. How do you know you've been shot in the head? And I often thought about that, and I think ever since that moment in all my adult life, I still keep a lookout for snipers lurking somewhere, whether they be technocrats, plutocrats, or bureaucrats. Some that can have exactly the same degree of surprise with them. So,
Was snipers a problem in Vietnam?
look, the single shot, but I'm not too sure in the classic sort of sniper sense. But there was
With telescopic sight?
No, but the single shot where you'd actually walked into a bunkers, these very well camouflaged bunkers and things like that, and the first shots that rang out, were generally deadly. But the whole idea that somebody setting up, I didn't have that experience, but we were out, out in the sticks, and this is what this sergeant said to me, and so I did. But I never saw one, nor did I hear one. So good news for me. And then my memories become very sketchy, because at this stage I think was getting up to easily 10 weeks out in the sticks by now. It's right at the, it's still dry season, it's hard rations, and everything then, settled down into a sort of a fairly dull, numbing sort of routine. And in retrospect, I wondered what my life was like at that point, considering what had happened there on the night of, or the morning of the 19th or the 18th of February. Seemed to put that into a sort of a zipped compartment somewhere. And what I felt very isolated, because there was nobody there. I was the sole witness, to this strange thing that occurred. Then came back to Nui Dat, and then I had a short stint up on Nui Dat Hill, which was wonderful actually, in terms of the relief. It had some, there was water on tap, you could shower, and you didn't have to be meagre with water rations and things like that. And of course, where Vietnam was sort of different to anywhere else, you could get all this electrical goods from the PX, and everybody, well, not everybody, but people were buying their Akai 1710W reel-to-reel tape recorders, and I think it was the Seekers, which were popular up on Nui Dat Hill at that particular time, and I was up there for a short period. Got horribly pissed one night and slept through a whole series of shifts. I should have been shot, but I wasn't. And I was told to go onto the dry, and that was a salutary thought for me, because I'd noticed coming back, starting to drink a bit, and it wasn't really taking much to sort of, get me intoxicated, not much at all. And I'm a pretty useless drunk, pretty legless. And then I went out to the Horseshoe to 31 Bravo, which is this sort of volcanic caldera, which was partly washed away at one end, hence giving it sort of horseshoe shaped, and it was a topographical feature aside of the Long Tan Dat Do Road, couple of 100 metres outside the village of Dat Do, which had the reputation of being VC sympathisers, whatever that really meant. But that was the reputation. And on the other side of Dat Do, that infamous fence that the Australian engineers built with the M16 landmines, which the Vietnamese lifted and used against us. And I think landmines were probably the most, how will I say, demoralising and terrifying weapon of the campaign from our point of view. I think I was never bombed by B-52s, but I think landmines, certainly carried a.
As far as Australians and Americans are concerned.
As far as the Australians were concerned, I think more people were killed on landmines and maimed on landmines than any other thing there. It was one of these, and I think they were made by the Honeywell Corporation, interestingly enough, these M16s. But we went out to the Horseshoe to 3-1 Bravo. Again, this was a very secure position, sort of sandbag trench lines with hard points and things like that. Our sleeping quarters were actually drilled out of rock. It was pretty secure, and you'd sit up there and you had a completely uninterrupted view looking into the, I think it was to the west, slightly southwest into the Nui Tai Vais, Nui Din, Nui Bo Quong mountains, which were at about 12,000 metres distance. Nui Dat was at about 8,000 metres, slightly to the right of those, and to the left were the Long Highs, which are limestone formation, and then moving in an arc away from Nui Dat, Nui Nay, Nui Dat Hill, and then to the sort of flat country looking up to Long Tan. And then if you did a complete 360, you could see the sand dunes of the South China Sea behind you. And we were there. I was there for a considerable length of time. Whilst I was there, the wet season started, and the battles of Coral and Balmoral took place. Luckily, I was not there, but I was at the Horseshoe at that time. And one of the things we used to do there is we'd go on what they called checkpoint duty, which would be a section of troops, and you'd saddle up tactically and patrol down to the checkpoint, and there were 2 checkpoints. And the one to the front of the Horseshoe was, at the edge of town. And the whole idea was that you were to sort of check ID cards, and these little ID cards had photographs on them and these unpronounceable names. And without sounding racist, every photograph looked like every other photograph you see on an ID. It just, I was going through the motions more than anything else. But it was a break, because this is where you could actually meet Vietnamese, ordinary people who would line up before the lifting of curfew, and this checkpoint overnight was manned by regional forces who were sort of, they were not fully trained infantry at all. They were just sort of popular rough puffs, I think was the acronym for them, regional force or popular force people, and they were at the lower end of the food chain when it came to supplies and all this sort of stuff. And they had the overnight duties there. We would go down during the day, and we would search vehicles. And vehicles consisted of these little 3-wheeled Lambrettas where you could sort of stick nearly a dozen Vietnamese people in the back, buffaloes coming through pulling wagons, small ponies pulling wagons, and the ubiquitous black pyjamas, Ho Chi Minh sandalled, sun-hatted populace coming through. And I found, and we had children there, and it was sort of interesting. I found that the Vietnamese more often than not seemed relatively gregarious. When you went to check a Lambretta, you got the look. Well, that's okay, because for me, became very obvious that I was very much, in somebody else's backyard now, and we were no longer sort of fighting against communists or king and country. We were fighting to do our best to get through 365 days and do the best you can and then come home. And it was during the times there, and these kids had come up with Coca-Colas, cucumbers, and you realise how poor these folks were. hideously dirt poor. But I think, and yet maintaining, I thought, a reasonable dignity in the face of overwhelming offence.
But you didn't see that at the time, did you?
Yeah, I did.
You did?
Oh, yeah.
So when did this dawn on you, this realisation about what actually is happening in Vietnam? What are we doing here?
My first, within 20 minutes of getting off the plane.
What you felt that way?
I had a pretty good hint. When I went into that mess hall and I saw all these Europeans, e.g. us and the Americans, and the people who were the servants were the Vietnamese. And we didn't look anything like them. And I just sort of found it interesting.
That's when you immediately started to think about it.
Oh, yeah.
But when did it start dawning on you?
Oh, when I at the Horseshoe.
At the Horseshoe.
Oh, yeah.
Why the Horseshoe?
Because that was the place where you were close to, you were meeting Vietnamese, on checkpoint duty. Where are these people going each day? Well, they're going out to work. How much are they earning? Well, they're not earning very much. These are families you're looking at. These are children, these are mothers, their grandmothers, their fathers, their aunties and uncles, And who am I to have this authority over them? I know I was doing a job, it's sort of, a bit of a rhetorical question, in some ways, but it became deadly obvious. And then I started to differentiate. Well, that day they said it was, VC sympathisers. Well, if we had the same thing back here in Australia, and the people were engaged in a popular struggle to overthrow a regime, the whole idea about being a sympathiser sort of becomes irrelevant, because it's what a community does in order to sort of fight tyranny. And these people, I don't even know they were communists, even though it was under a communist umbrella. What they got from their own government was pretty meagre. And what they got from us, and when us I mean, the US and the military, also was pretty meagre. If an Australian soldier was wounded, he was, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour at most from the best facilities, you could possibly get. If some poor Vietnamese had his leg blown off on an unexploded bomb or a landmine, where did they go? There were no ambulances. The hospitals were run on the smell of an oily rag. They had no access to the military medical system whatsoever, except in very rare occasions when civil affairs ran what they call med caps and things like that, which was a civil affairs function. But these people, who also suffered from such diseases I learnt later, thalassemia. It's really, it's a high incidence blood disorder amongst those sort of subtropical climes amongst the people. Malaria. Various parasitical things. Clean water is always a problem, and these people, after years and years of warfare, are trying to sort of make the best of their lives by being. I don't know how the families owned the paddy fields, or whether they're indentured labour or whatever have you, but you'd have these people come at 8 o'clock in the morning. They've been lining up for an hour, and they'd walk out down these roads carrying these loads on these sort of yoke poles, and they'd work all day out in the paddy, back-breaking work. And paddy fields are rotten places, and they'd come back in again, and they'd do this day in, day out, and this was their life. I mean, they didn't have money to buy these sorts of luxuries, so consequently, all the graft and black market and things like that. I thought it was somewhat challenging, to say the least.
Can you tell us about your most interesting experiences at the Horseshoe in terms of checkpoint searches and?
Yeah, I was. A Lambretta came through, and there was all these sort of Asian faces looking at you under sort of these conical hats, and there's granddads and the usual mixture, the odd chicken in a basket and all this thing. And just at the very end of the Lambretta, or towards the end, there was a young mother, and I assumed it was her son. And I'd been sort of going, chow go, chow man, practicing my sort of, mongrel Vietnamese. And one of the things which is which I had learned, which was considered particularly impolite. You can bomb their village, but some things are particularly impolite. One is to touch children on the head. The other one is to show the soles of your feet to your guests. You don't do things like that. And as I'd been sort of checking through these little ID cards for this kid, little boy, about 3, I think, or thereabouts, he was holding a cushion to his chest, and I don't know what happened, but my hand came close to his head and looked as though it was going to the cushion or something like that. I just don't know how that actually occurred, but the reaction of the mother was instantaneous. She brushed my hand away, and I was instantly suspicious, and quite alert to what's going on. And I took the kid's cushion, this little cushion, out of his hand, started feeling around, and there was something in there. And she started becoming really quite vocal about this. And I opened it up. What do you open up? You use a bayonet, of course. Very tender sort of things to sort of be flashing in front of civilians. And there were 2 military issue D-cell batteries right in the middle of this cushion. Now, I don't know what they're going to be used for, but I got no idea as to why. Well, I got a rough idea, but here they were, being held by this child inside a cushion in the back of a Lambretta, and all of a sudden the mother starts becoming highly distressed and agitated by going, me no VC, VC number 10, Octoloy number 1, VC number 10, going like this, and this kid is wide-eyed. And what was going through my mind, I don't know, batteries were used, to fire up circuits or to close circuits, and one of the circuits you can close on there is a lifting device on an M16 mine. When you stand on an M16, it's a pressure release charge. You detonate and it lifts up into the air but there's got to be a charge underneath. There's got to be a circuit underneath, to sort of lift that. Whether this is true or whether it's the mythology, I really don't know. But you use batteries to charge circuits. And so I thought, goodness, what have I got here? So I told her to get out, to get out of the Lambretta and sit down over there, because I was the ranking NCO at this particular thing. Got onto the radio to my headquarters 30, which was back at Nuda, and so this is what I've got. And they told me to sort of wait over, sort of thing. Gave me another frequency to get onto, and I'll never forget, the call sign was Tarzan Raisin. Could nothing be anything but American. And I got onto this call sign, and they told me that somebody would be there soon, but to hold the suspect and the Lambretta there. So they're held there. Meanwhile, there's this procession of people banking up because no one is coming through. The troops are on their feet now, a bit alert. She's really sort of still very distressed, and and somebody's saying, won't somebody shut the bitch up or something like that. It was only a comment made, but then somebody offered her a cigarette, glass of water. The kid was there, and eventually this Jeep came from Dat Do with this American Special Forces officer, Green Beret type, and this Vietnamese with a red beret and tiger stripe cam uniform. Well, when she saw them, she just went ballistic. She became highly agitated, highly distressed, started weeping there in the top of her voice. Me no VC, VC number 10. He came up. I said, I'm Bombardier Miller, and this is what I've found. Well done, Bombardier, sort of thing. Took the batteries, grabbed her by the hair, dragged her off into the Jeep, threw her into the back of the Jeep, did a Yui, and went back down to town. Meanwhile, her son, whose jaw is sort of wide-eyed and tears, coming down his face, is just standing there outside the Lambretta on the ground. and I went into a rage. You know, I didn't express it physically, but my brain was, raging at the time, and I picked the kid up, dropped him into the back of the Lambretta, went round to the driver and sort of stuck the barrel of my M16 very close to his face and told him to, did him out, quick time, just get out of here, because by this time the kid was really, in highly distressed. Yeah, and then the Lambretta went down this dusty road past the Horseshoe, heading towards Longtan. Meanwhile, there were all these people who couldn't get out, to do their work out in the paddocks out in the paddies. We processed them through. And towards evening, we used to saddle up at about 1600 hours, and then went back up to the listening post on 31 Bravo. A couple of days later, it was late in the afternoon, about 1500 hours or thereabouts, there was a couple of detonations down at the checkpoint. Now, occasionally you'd heard it during the night, but to hear them during the day, because there were always Australian troops down there during the day, and they were under attack from at least three VC who were up the road and off to the side, and I got caught up as being part of a ready reaction force, which was loaded into the back of one of these tracked American ammunition carriers, a soft-skin vehicle. And we went rattling down, and I was standing up the side looking over, and there was an American up on the gun. I think it was a 50 up there, and the driver. We come slewing out of the Horseshoe at a great rate, down the road, turn onto the road, and I could see a couple of hats on the other side. So as we went through, the firing just started and sort of built up to an intensity, and I just sort of fired in their general direction. I got no idea whether I hit anything or not, and then my bloody weapon jammed, which was really handy. And I then saw this Yank sort of barrel out of the top of this ammunition carrier, and my brain just clicked on and said, oh, he's been hit. But he hadn't been. He actually jumped. He hadn't been hit at all. Got up to where these soldiers were, and at that stage there was a dead digger being sort of carried out of the line of fire, which was coming directly down the road from this. And I got out and I deployed along the road, and I noticed by the time I was pumping, pretty high adrenaline at this stage, and I noticed to my right, on the other side of the road, there must have been 60 civilians, all jammed up against a barbed wire fence, and bang in the middle of the road, because we must have run over the top of her, where she went between the two tracks, was the body of a young woman just laying quite peacefully there in the middle of the road. And was there, not firing, there was no return of fire coming in, and about 10 minutes later, maybe 15, I can't really tell, this gunship came in and did a couple of runs up and down the road there, and that was it. It was over. It was finished. And I can remember looking at these people who were jammed up against the fence. I mean, these just ordinary people who had just been through an experience of they could have been killed. They weren't. But this young woman, I suppose 18 or 19, she had been, and she was put onto a stretcher, helped put her onto a stretcher, couldn't find a wound on her, and put her on the stretcher. I remember sort of lifting her up, and what had happened, well, this is what I think had happened, is the bullet had gone inside her ear and it exited through the back of her head, through her hair, and killed her that way. And she was taken up under the Horseshoe, and her family came to collect her next day and took her back down to that doe. And about 2 days after that, I happened to be down at the Horseshoe, or down at that checkpoint, when the funeral came through. And it was a really confronting sort of thing to have an Asian Buddhist funeral coming towards you with the bells and cymbals and things like that. They got to the checkpoint and went silent. And luckily for me, I didn't get the job of having to search the coffin for weapons. And then check the IDs. These people just wouldn't look at us. They averted their gaze and checked the IDs on the funeral procession, and off it went down the road, and got about, I don't know, 30 paces past us again, and you know, the bells and whistles and the cymbals started up again, and they disappeared down the road. And so that was an odd experience there, with about nearly the sum total of my civilian contact, other than sort of RNC and Berea or in Berea? No, Vaughan Tower. And a couple of runs to Berea. But I had another incident at the Horseshoe. Well, I had a pleasant experience at the Horseshoe. The defence and employment of the Horseshoe was taken over by a New Zealand company. I think it was Victor Company at the time. And waking up there early in the morning to the smell of freshly baking bread. I still smell baking bread. It's a lovely smell, but unfortunately I associate it with the Horseshoe for some peculiar reason. And just before I was due to leave there, a New Zealand element of this D&E platoon or company was caught in a mine and ambush incident out towards the Long Green, and I was part of the Ready Reaction Force, because our LP on the Horseshoe actually had a machine gun. We had an M60, and we were told to get that and come down, and then and it was the full box and dice. Had something like 3 or 4 helicopters arrive, and we got into the helicopters and flying out in sort of formation to where this ambush had occurred, and hit the ground running there, and there was obvious there'd been a serious encounter. There were bits around the ground, and as we came in, we were also with the dust off, and they were taking people on the dust off. Got down onto the ground, and I was on the extreme, if we're looking forward, to the extreme left-hand flank with the gun. And the skies just opened up, and it just poured raining. There got saturated, and didn't seem to warm up after that. There didn't seem to be much of that sort of humidity in that. It just sort of remained cold. And then got into a creek line, and we were advancing through the creek line, and it turned out to be a camp. And the ingenuity of the Vietnamese is that they had their tunnels on the reverse side of the river bank, of the creek bank, built in, going in at right angles, then dodging off at right angles again, down through the roots of trees. It was really quite impressive. Didn't find anybody in there. Found evidence of equipment, but nothing there. We got out, and then we had to go and form up for the helicopters to come in and take us out. And I remember there was this Kiwi sergeant beside me as we were going to get back into this helicopter, and of course you had to go through the procedure of clearing your weapons, and he realised he hadn't cocked his weapon and he'd gone through this whole bunker complex. Well, it wasn't a big bunker complex, but he'd gone through there with an unloaded weapon. Yeah, and he made comments to, "Oh my gods," at the end of that. So we got back to the Horseshoe, and some short time after that, I was rotated back to Nui Dat. And somewhere around about this time, I actually went out on a short operation, which only lasted, I think, about a week. And it was in the area up past Long Tan. I'm not too sure of the exact, exactly where it was, and it turned out to be a dead failure actually, because for the life of us we couldn't get radio communications. It just happened to be one of those sort of odd sort of anomalies. But I was there with a battery, and had, I think, two interesting experiences, both wildlife related, when I was there. And in fact, the solution to one didn't come back until I was back in Australia many years. And one of the things we had to do was go out on a standing patrol, which is generally, you and two others, whatever it was, and to go out to a point about 50 to 100 metres outside the fire support base and just sit and prop and listen. And that's all we had to do. And we were going to come in just on before last light. We were going to stand out there just into stand 2 and then come back. And we were out there, and we were right next to a rubber plantation there, and I started hearing this sort of rustling sound, and then it started to multiply, all these rustling sounds moving, and then out of the forest litter came this very interesting insect, and the head of it was bright red, so it might give you an idea that it was certainly not vegetarian. About the size of my thumb, with a compound jewelled eye in the middle of its head, and at the front these two vertical interlocking jaws, and coming down to a cone-shaped tail, again which was bright red, with black bands around it, and had two pincers at the front, where sort of there, and these things are coming out of the dark. And I remember sticking a bayonet through one of them and quite distinctly hear these jaws sort of clacking together. Good grief, what's this? You wouldn't want one of these running up your trouser leg. And we had to come back in, and we were overrun by insects at the time. And it was years and years later, I think the popular name for this bug in country was the RTA bug, which stood for the Return to Australia bug. But what I did find out, it was actually a variety of tailless whip scorpion, which lives in that part of the world. But that's just an aside. And another wildlife aside is I remember leaning up against a sandbag, and as I stood back from the sandbag, there was this banded crate, which is a local reptile, highly venomous, about 12-14 inches long, with very distinctive bands on it, and it didn't move, so I gave it a bit of a prod, and it still didn't move. So I lifted the sandbag, and feeding on this banded crate was the biggest centipede I'd ever seen in the world. It was about this big, and it actually stripped all the flesh, down to what would have been the snake's shoulder blades, I suppose. There, I thought, that's interesting. There are all sorts of interesting bugs there. One of the things I haven't mentioned is that though I spent most of my time in Vietnam awake at night, they got fireflies there. And you'd be out there and you'd see these lights dancing in the distance, and you really couldn't tell whether they were a lot of small lights very close to you or big lights very far away, or whether they were in convoy and these sorts of things. And the nights were always punctuated with these detonations of H&I firings, sometimes gunships off in the distance. And one quite disconcerting phenomena, there was an American aircraft called a Mohawk, which had a sideways-looking radar, aperture type radar, and it would fire this flash which would illuminate the countryside in black and white negative, and then it would take this radar photo, and you'd see these sort of popping off all over the countryside at night from time to time. And so they were the nights, and when the day came after stand 2, we used to have our transistor radios, we'd switch them on, and it used to start off with the 6 o'clock news from AFRTS Saigon, with specialists for Don Burnside or something saying good morning Vietnam, and then we used to get another episode of Chicken Man. Used to sort of come over the airwaves, and so they were our sort of days, the way we'd sort of kick off the days there sometimes after the odd night. Anyway, that was just an aside. After those, very shortly after it, I came back from the Horseshoe, and must have been about September, I think now, and I'm ready to come home, I think, at this stage.
Just before we get to that,
yes.
you're talking about patrols and so on. What are the emotions that you go through in patrols, and how dangerous are they?
I can't really say. I only ever did one patrol. And that was 1 day, 1 night, 1 day, and return. And and this particular standing patrol, which wasn't uncommon at other fire support bases, where you're told to go and sit out there, keep quiet, and just keep your eyes and ears open, that sort of thing. But where I did this this night patrol, or this day patrol and the night patrol, because of the area we're in, over the back of the horseshoe, the thing I think was in everybody's minds was tripping a landmine. I think everybody was really very focused on that, and you really watched where you're putting your boot. Fortunately, I've never personally experienced being within a primary detonation of a landmine. And what I've read after, I'm so glad that I never did. You remain alert. You have duties to perform on patrol, maintaining your arcs, which is from the forward scout, he does 180 to front. The second scout does 180 to one side. The first rifleman does 180 to the second side. The next rifleman again. Then you get your section commander, your gun group, SIG, and I was the RT. I was an artillery, operating as an artillery SIG on this one. I don't really know why or how, but that's the way it turned out. And then you get a couple of more riflemen, tail end Charlie, and we were moving in a tactical, slightly offset, single file formation across this sort of broken landscape of paddy fields, shrubbery, secondary type scrub. As I said, the predominant focus is don't step on a landmine. The second one is, 1, 2 and 3 is be alert from there on. And that night went up into, I suppose it was a lying up it wasn't a formal ambush, it was a lying up position. And you just realise how dark it is at night. It's like the insides of a dead dog, it's that dark. And then you have these cords, and when your duty comes up, actually it was better doing them, because I actually did my LP duty with the person who was doing the shift on the gun. So there were two of you there, whereas in all my times on LP duty at night, it was just me, it was just yourself there. And this I found a lot easier. And actually, I would be halfway through my LP picket or my radio picket, and they were all offset halfway. So within half your time there, you had somebody fresh come on the gun, and you could send somebody away down this cord to the next person, because you're pretty close together. You don't want anybody getting up and walk. And it did happen, and this is friendly fire, not artillery, but it had been on occasions where some people had been shot, where they got disorientated, gone out of the lying up position, and actually had to come back in through it and got shot that way.
How often was that?
Not very often, but I understand it happened. I only know this in retrospect on sort of reading up on incidents, and sometimes, very unfortunately, where, say, as section, this is all infantry stuff, they're the ones who were sort of put in these positions, where one section might bang into the tail end Charlie of another section, And I do know of one recorded instance I read where an infantry platoon section was actually in an ambush position, and the person in that position had the good sense not to fire immediately, and it was another Australian section actually walking into what they call the killing ground, which was a very defined area within an ambush position, the killing ground, and that's why it's called that. Nobody lives in the killing ground, and I've only just sort of read about that. So that was sort of, that was about the sum total of my sort of infantry type experience, and I'm glad that I had a little taste of it, but that was a 3-course meal for me. within that, and and that's why I take my hat off to because they were out on 6-week patrols, and I think it was probably bad enough where nothing happened in 6 weeks, but if only just a little bit happened and you still had 5.5 weeks to go, or you'd gone 5.5 weeks to go, and somebody is either accidentally killed or you're ambushed or something like that, really quite how those blokes sort of did it for 12 months, I think is truly astounding.
You said the worst thing is looking for mines.
Mm.
How do you actually look for mines? Is there a lump on the ground or?
Nah. I think the way you find out you're on mines is when somebody stepped on one. I mean, the M16 mine had 3 metal prongs, no larger than sort of the diameter of, say, they were just 3 wire prongs, and they just had to be, have a leaf over the top, and you wouldn't know. And as far from what I've read, that is the way they found out where the mines were, is when somebody stood on one. And of course, the person it was a pressure release, so they'd stand on it and you'd get a click. And I know what that click, even though I've never heard it, I know exactly what that click would sound like. As soon as the boot came off the mine would lift into the air at about chest height and then detonate. And terrible, terrible injuries.
Could they do anything to defeat it if they heard the click? Could they stand there, or there was nothing they could do at all?
I don't think there was anything that could be done. Not for the person that's standing on it. I mean, if the person had enough, how will I say, awareness, they could stand on the mine and not move, which is a recorded incidence of somebody standing on a mine. The primary, firing has occurred, and he's told everybody to clear off. Yeah. And then stepped off the mine. Terrible. Just terrible. And these mines produced shocking injuries, multiple traumatic amputations through and through, and blast injuries, And I think the worst part about it, they were laid by Australian engineers. Not that you hold them responsible, but it brings into question the laying of mines and leaving them unguarded. You've got to guard a minefield. It's as simple as that. And of course, they're cheap, they're nasty. I remember there at the Horseshoe, somebody went out laying mines somewhere, and it was most likely the VC. I don't see why it would, because they relied on places like Dapto for resupply, but they were bringing in these water buffalo with their snouts and legs blown off, and they sort of another water buffalo or horse, and this thing sort of partially butchered in the back, sort of going back into town, or maybe the Americans laid them. I really don't know with these sorts of things, but. Very unpleasant things indeed.
You were saying, back to where we left off, you were getting sick of the place. And so.
Yes, I was becoming very, quite, I'd sort of, by 8 months or thereabouts, I'd sort of, felt as though I'd had enough. And I really didn't want to know more. And I'd also made up my mind that I was going, as soon as my tour had finished, I'd be getting out of the army anyway. I'd done, I had my fill of the army, so I'd also made that decision as well. Came back to Nui Dat, and then a mate of mine who, in the sort of the unit newsletter before he died, here in a freak rail accident actually, was also described as a colourful character, which is generally code for arsehole or bastard, or and Frank was a bastard. I can tell you that with all due respect, all due respect. But he introduced me to dope, and I found out that after my first joint, actually it was a pipe, that for me it saved me psychologically. Because as I mentioned earlier, I'd hammer the alcohol, and it was not very good for me at all. Not very good. And I can remember getting back to Nui Dat, and Frank arrived back with his bag of green that he reckons he'd picked up at Kangaroo Corner, cost him $2 MPC or something like that. So I loaded up a pipe, and for me, it just changed my outlook completely. Couldn't stop laughing hysterically, quite hysterically, because everything seemed to, my brain just went through several paradigms of order and disorder at the same time. I think, goodness gracious, for all the reasons that I have come here have now been utterly and completely refuted. This is one sort of order of thinking that went with it. Also, I found out that when intoxicated with marijuana, I could actually still walk around and talk without sort of, falling over or falling into holes or being caught on barbed wire and things like that. So it had that particular advantage, and I could, when I was at Nui Dat, I could sort of squirrel my way up to one of the, gun pits somewhere like that on the perimeter, especially up near the Yanks, the 2nd, 35th, have a pipe up there and just stare out into the mountains and sort of be transported somewhere. Never smoked on duty, never smoked, I never went out, never went out again anyway. But just had, it was just in those sort of, down times. And I was also starting to feel physically unwell. I'd lost weight. I was having this recurrent rashes. There was one there that went by the wonderful but highly descriptive name of Nui Dat crutch. And the remedy for Nui Dat crutch was to bathe one's genitals and associated regions with methylated spirits. Well, fantastic, Is this the best that the medical corps could come up with? So at least the date was a little bit of a painkiller in that regard, and I was, I think, becoming very, very fatigued. I'd come off duty in, say, TAC headquarters, and I noticed that I was spending more and more sack time. We had in Nui Dat, in our area, we had stretchers, and spending quite a long time. Reduced socialisation amongst my mates there, and everything became an effort. You always had marauding sergeants moving around looking for bodies who were idle, to sort of dig a latrine, fill sandbags, count cartridge cases, you name it, these sorts of things. But I was, becoming, more and more, I wanted to be home. People got obsessed with counting. This is why I didn't mind being out in the bush or the horseshoe, because the horseshoe at least gave variation away, and all of a sudden you went from, say, 160 days in a wake and you're down to 110, which is a doddle, in certain ways. So, and these nights are going to Artie TAC headquarters, and you had all these maps sort of, and these lines where you could things, and you had the air to ground net, so you could hear what's happening with all the helicopters, and if clearance had to be made for the guns to fire, it was all happening around you, and then you go through these permutations that if you went from, is 80 days to go, multiply by that 60 to sort of, to bring it down to minutes and seconds, and these sorts of things. And I used to drink this foul instant tea, which was terrible. And that was the sort of time, and just sort of winding down until I think it was about 30 and a wakey, you start taking your malarial purgative. I call it that because it just cleans you out like you wouldn't believe. See, those other things that came to mind, the ordinary and the everyday. As I said earlier about comparing what was an ordinary day for me and an ordinary day here in Australia. Well, here in Australia, an ordinary day, if you went to the toilet, you pressed a button or pulled a chain. Well, you didn't there. You had these bloody thunderboxes with sort of Hessian and things like that, and the company blowfly would come along, every so often blow them up, with kerosene and things like that. And some bastards, while you're having a crap, would get down the other end and drop a bloody smoke grenade, and you come out with a purple arse, those sorts of hijinks and jolly japes, and always drinking water that was tainted, and even more so when you think now, with the spraying, the aerial spraying, of course the water was tainted. You had it in your pores, your head, your skin, your clothing. You just couldn't get away from these various contaminants and things like that. And I had a salutary lesson as to how dirty I was overseas. I went on R&R. I was out in the bush when I was given the. I didn't even know I was due for R&R, and I was out at some place. I've got no place where I had to keep an eye out for snipers. That place there. Then you saw the colour of the soil was this sort of rich red soil there, and
Clay, was it?
it was a clay. Yeah, it was a clay loam, I think, and a helicopter came in. Somebody came out and said, get on board. You're on R&R. This is about 3 or 2 in the afternoon, or 1 in the afternoon, or thereabouts. Dry season, still dry season. Flew back to Navidad, on R&R, and I'd booked to go to Taipei. The reason I picked Taipei is to get all these articles on R&R places, and here's this photograph of an American GI in this beautiful rectangular tiled bath with these 2 Chinese lovelies in the bath with him. He's got his hands on his chin like that. I said, that's the place I'm going to, So, and we used to shower in these canvas buckets, and during the dry, you're on water, one shower bucket at a time, and just hauled him up, filling up with water, had a shower, got into what they call pollies, these sort of, walking out day sorts of uniform. Flew down, caught the Wallaby flight from Lushcombe, I don't know, 3, half 3, 4 o'clock, was in Saigon by 5, and by 7 o'clock, flying out on Pan Am to Taipei, rocked into Taipei at about 10, and then I knew where I was going. It was to this place where I'd seen the photograph, a place called Pietu, which is about, 20 minutes by taxi out of town, and it seems the taxi driver had no trouble finding the place, actually. And it was a mineral springs sort of area where Japanese businessmen used to go for a bit of nookie restaurant recreation. And I remember going out there and being introduced to my partners for the evening after sort of negotiating with the Mama-san concierge mates, whatever you want to call them. And, and everything was fairly enthusiastic, titter, chatter, and got into this bath. And very soon, the titter and chatter, dropped away because the water, which was crystal clear, just turned to soup. And it was me. And what's more, the thing about this, it took more than 1 bath before we could get through a bath, and having relatively clear water, at the end of it. And it really just as a highlight, how your self-perception changes. Because, for instance, for mirrors, we never, the only mirrors we had, if we're going to do, were small shaving mirrors, so you never got to see yourself really. And of course in the army they used to take, for a shave, if you don't know where your face is, what do you need a mirror for, sort of logic. And so that was just a sort of an interesting aside when I went to sort of Taipei and just realised that I was in fact filthy.
How long did you go without a shower or bath? Or?
Oh, gee, well, I'll tell you, the time I went out in January, I would have gone January, February, late March to nearly April. I mean, we used to call them pommy washers, with all due respect to the English, where you'd sort of dip your finger in your... a few of those, but we were pretty rank, yeah. But you didn't know, But occasionally, you'd smell somebody else, and
it's probably you.
It's probably me that was just sort of done it you. But when I think about it, I sort of very mentioned early in this piece that this place, Fire Support Base Harrison, and you lived in the ground. And watching this company of infantry come in out of patrols, and I'll never forget the look of them again. Not only their physical looks of their faces and things like that, but the look of the way their greens hung on them. You know, their clothing. You know, they were almost melded, and yet there was certain, you know, it was sort of baggy and daggy and things like that. But they had been wedded to those, you know, to those uniforms for a considerable length of time without resupply. There was no doubt about that. And yeah,
we've heard before that people to get through the. We've heard before that guys would go without wearing underwear and socks. Was that the case?
Correct. Fly undone, no underwear, no socks. And the myth was that it was an advantage, but with this Nui-Dat crutch thing that was about, you couldn't wear underwear anyway. It was just too painful. And I'd noticed, and I sort of mentioned about the absence of mirrors. I had something growing on my back. I could feel it, but I couldn't see it, you know, which is, you know, sort of a handy. The skin just seemed to be very dead in these sorts of shilling-sized areas on the back. But it was a different condition to the condition in the groin, which was also a bit different to the condition between the toes. Yeah.
Was it constant pain and discomfort?
Yeah. Yeah, it was, that's what I haven't. I've completely forgotten all about it. The prickly heat drives you mad. Yeah, I've forgotten about prickly heat, and I forget what the things you never did. You never scratched it and things like that, but it would drive. You know, you were just electrified by it. From, you know, and with the combination of these other pustular things and, you know, raw skin, you know, it was no good. And in fact, I remember many times there. Having these, I really don't know how hot it used to get during the day there. Let's say 30, you know, about 30 something degrees, you know, with about 1,000,000% humidity. A bit similar to the sauna that I actually pay money to go and sit in these days. And you'd just sit there and you'd feel these, you know, these beads of perspiration break out over your eyebrows, and they just build and build until the surface, you know, and you dare not breathe, and the surface tension would just rupture and you'd be soaked in almost this instant wash of perspiration going from head, neck, armpit, groin, knees, feet, you know. And I often wonder, you know, how did we ever work? Or how did those grunts ever sort of, you know, carry anything and things like that? But it's understandable that this place was where I was there for a week, you know, and what a waste of time that was. This was during the wet season, and I can remember I thought I'd sort of got my hydrological engineering right with my pit by digging a sump at the front of my pit down well beneath the surface of where I was going to sleep. First rain we got that afternoon, you know, I thought it was a swimming pool. It was terrible.
You mentioned earlier about marijuana.
Yeah.
Were you taking that as a coping mechanism or trying to look for answers? Or
No, it was a release. It was an alternative instead of alcohol. No, I wouldn't. Yeah, there was nothing. I knew that I had found a viable alternative intoxicant, and it carried no more weight than that at the particular time. Probably had more weight looking back over my shoulder, but at the time it just made me feel very, very good. And also, unlike alcohol, it didn't seem to muddle my thinking. I mean, it took it to some very strange places. I mean, it's very strange to be sort of sitting down there and Frank has got an unloaded but cocked M16 and you got the barrel in your mouth and the front side about here on your nose, and he blows a shot up through the barrel of this bloody M16. I mean, yeah, it's a bit odd.
Did that actually happen?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah, that happened. Yeah, shotgunning. I think it was quite popular amongst the Yanks at the time. Not many people. Frank and I, as far as I know, were the only two in our unit who so of course you get shot. If if you were found out. But I was, he and I were the only two that smoked, and I think with Frank it was to get me into trouble, or something like that.
Did that make you sort of outsiders of the group?
Look, it's interesting. I think mateship is a paradoxical thing. It's like raucous male laughter in pubs. There are a couple of blokes there, that we used to have deep and meaningfuls. There is no doubt about that. But in the main, it was you were mates. That was about it. But there were one or two. It was sort of bonhomie and joviality at times at, say, a unit barbecue or something like that. And we had one bloke we used to call the $1 million body with the 10-cent head, which is, and he's one of the nicest blokes in the battery, actually. He really was. He was a bodybuilder and one of the kindest, gentlest people I think I've ever met. And we used to shit can him like you wouldn't believe. And he accepted it, and he could have snapped our necks like like celery stalks, with that in it. But I would say when I went and smoked, smoked alone. Yeah, always Frank occasionally, but never an expanded group.
From what we've heard, it was more an American thing rather
Very.
than an Australian thing.
It was very American, but Frank was into things. He had things like, and of course, coming back with his bag of green that he'd picked up from God knows when. I tell you what, it was pretty good stuff. It was great. Yeah.
Did the other guys know what you're up to, or?
I don't think so. No, didn't advertise it at all. So the answer is no. And as I said, we tended to go up to one of the sort of bunkers up by the Yanks, which was only, 200 metres from where we were. And we just sort of sitting there and sort of, get ripped there. It's quite strange sort of getting ripped, as I tell with the incident. And just sort of laying your cheek down and looking down the rear side of an M60 machine gun, out into the long high hills, and there's a full 100 bullet, link just sort of sitting there, and all you got to do is cock it and fire it. That's it. Quite strange.
Do you think you would have got through your tour without it?
Yeah, but I don't think I would have got through life later. I think I would have been, as I said, for me it presented being as an alternative intoxicant, and if I had stuck to alcohol, I think I would have had significant problems with alcohol. Yeah. So I could have got through without it, but I don't think I would have gone mixing beer and spirits though. And Bacardi was $1.20 a bottle, or thereabouts. Beer, I think, was, as I said earlier, I think it was only 10 cents or 12 cents a can. Even though you're supposed to be rationed 2 days per man, perhaps 2 cans per day. 2 cans per day per man, perhaps. Yeah, that was the way it was. But there were ways around that. You go up the Yanks and get a crate of Bud or a crate of Schlitz or whatever they used to drink. Plus on your PX card, brandy, rum, Bacardi was pretty popular, and those sorts of things. Alcohol would have been there. If I hadn't have had that, I would have continued to drink, even though I was put on the dry at one stage. But it would have been a real problem.
Talking of bartering and so on, how much went on between the Australians and the Americans?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I remember flogging a greatcoat of all things. You know about the army issued greatcoats, these big, heavy coats with the brass buttons for a couple of sets of American fatigues, which were very comfortable to wear, better than the Australian greens. But anybody who could use a greatcoat in Vietnam, good luck to them. Look, I don't know, because again, I come back to the point. The contact with the Americans was, I mean, if you measured all the contact I had with Americans, and concentrated over 365 days, 3 days. So that's it.
Did you feel the Australians were supplied sufficiently?
We always thought the Yanks had everything that opened and shut. Okay. Look, you had a weapon, you had your greens. I mean, the food was rubbish. And I'm talking, not so much talking about, the C rations or D rations, whatever they called them when you went out to field, and they were all American anyway. There was some aspect about the Australian ration packs were really quite good, because really, anybody who found ham and lima beans attractive, or the egg, they had this egg thing, in a tin, which was quite strange. I suppose it was an omelette-y thing, an American, I think, American tastes are sort of different, but they had good mixtures of, say, of the desserts, especially little fruit salad-y things and things like that. But back in, say, Nui-Dat, now we had a regimental mess with, cooks there, still rubbish. I mean, it was all variations of mince, and this milk that tasted of ether, and fresh eggs were just, it just wasn't there. So in terms of that sort of supply, no. Oh, I did mention it out at the Horseshoe, fresh bread, which was great. I can't remember, there was really butter there, but I don't remember, that we could sort of scoop it on, but there must have been. No, the rations weren't all that, and that is about a money and supply issue. One of the sort of issues I think we were constantly reminded by, I mean, really news from home changed after the Tet Offensive. And then, having wharf strikes and students, donating money to the National Liberation Front, it didn't go down off that well amongst the troops. And also having the post and mail was a very important conduit with home. And having, the postal workers not delivering your mail and things like that didn't go down terribly well at all. And one would think, I suppose, in the modern day, I had a lot of negative thoughts about this. It was not good.
How important was the postie when you delivered those letters and
It was tremendously important. I mean, really, it's surprising what a letter is in those certain sort of circumstances. It was very important. And of course, they're all a source of, the great thing about Australians, for every 7 Australians, you've got 6 comedians, and the banter, and that's what I miss, what I really soaked in. I wish I could have remembered some of these things word for word, because that was very, very funny stuff. It's the interactions, and of course, what was the priority? Sex, maybe a Monaro when I get back home, and more sex, things like that. Because the Monaro is just sort of coming out, and maybe people, but you'd hear all this highly politically incorrect but wonderful sort of repartee and banter sort of going on from time to time. But mail was very, very important, and it was a very humanising thing. I mean, it's very easy for people in that young men far away as essentially overlords within somebody else's country, you can lose your humanity, very, very quickly. And I think the mail helped forge some links that some people didn't lose that humanity. But, it also gave you a point to get into it. If the posties went on strike, you could sort of, curse, all sorts of six demons about them and things like that. But very important indeed.
So back on when you were actually firing the guns and so on, what was the process there and what position were you?
Okay, look, I was indirect because I was in LPs, but I was familiar with quite familiar with the procedure. Okay, an infantry unit would be out in the field, and every infantry company had it with what they call an FO, a forward observer, who was an officer, and they had what they called the FO Ardiac, who was generally a bombardier, and there'd be the FO party made up of a bombardier and another gunner, who were the direct radio communications back to a battery. And each infantry unit had its attendant battery. And each FO would use one particular gun within a section, which they knew that the barrel was more true than the barrel of the other ones, because they're firing tens of thousands of rounds. And what would happen is that wherever that infantry section was going, the FO and the FO party had to know exactly where they were on the ground with their maps, doing various and counting steps. So they had to know exactly where they were in case something happened. And if something happened, e.g. a contact or something like that, the forward observer party would call what they call a fire mission, and it would start up, 3-0, this is 9-1, fire mission over. And this became a priority order. Nobody got onto that airwave or interrupted a fire mission once it was set in train. And that fire mission was coming directly from the FO party into the CP, command post of the battery, to the battery captain, and they'd be getting such information of the description of the target. They would be getting a bearing where that FO party was, a bearing to the target and a range, and that would be plotted back in the CP to adjust for the where they were. Because all guns, it was quite scientific, all guns started in the First World War, where they actually started to survey guns in, so you knew where the guns were in relation to the solar system, so to speak. And so wherever you were, if that was properly surveyed in, you could be anywhere and you could get corresponding lines of angles to where you were to bring the guns in. So that would be all done, and it would be plotted in the CP, and then the fire orders would go to the guns through the gun position officer, who would come up with 3 rounds ranging number 6 gun, and then the gun would come into action. They would the number 3 would lay the gun. The gun sergeant was overall supervising the work. You'd have one of the other gun numbers setting the fuse, turning it around, and then you'd be given the order to fire. And on the order fire would come over, and shot out would be the response at the forward end, and they would wait for the time of flight, and hopefully if they knew exactly where they were, the round would land more or less in front of them, not behind them or over the top. Because you had to work out, you had to be careful of things like airburst, hitting a tree, which is quite a random event, but or if you didn't know where you were, the rounds landing behind you or on you. So, and then you would give your adjusting, it would always move your rounds across, then drop or then increase, and then they would give the order for for the battery once they're on target with the ranging gun, 5 rounds fire for effect, and then the 12 guns of the battery would fire 5 rounds of each, one after the other, and then you would get a description of whether any further fire missions are required. And then, if necessary, if the people were in such a position, or the enemy was in such a position, you may have to call an airstrike, and then you'd get onto the forward observer would switch to the air-ground frequency, and the call sign of the forward observers for the in these sort of light spotting planes, I think, was Jade, and they'd get on there, and Jade would probably mark the target with white phosphorus. And then the next thing you know, coming out of the heavens would be a 1 or 2, 3, 4 F4 Phantoms with a full load of ordnance, ranging from 20mm cannon to 750 kilogram iron bombs to napalm, and that would be dropped on the target.
Did this give you a bit of distance from what was happening to the enemy?
Yeah. It's always happening over there. It was always, but you're part of it. I mean, because you could hear it going on, and you become adept at switching frequencies and listening into radio traffic and things like that. You become quite adept at that. But it was, it's pretty innocuous. Targets, a bunker. It's a bunker. Pity there were 4 people in there, but and then you get each morning we'd have what they call an orders group, where section commanders, section commanders and things like, we would attend an orders group, and this is a breakdown of what had happened the previous 24 hours, and you'd get such ex-contacts, 6 VC KIA, 5 crew serve weapons captured, 6 AK-47s, 1 RPD, all very, very bland and bureaucratic. It had, didn't carry any smell with it whatsoever, and this would come over. But I can't remember when I was out during the TET time of things, having too many orders groups, because things were just happening, and we had no idea really what was. We knew a lot was happening, but we had no idea, and yet it was interrupted with the most paradoxical events too, where we were at there had been one, and all of a sudden a 707 with Pan Am written all over would come out over the trees, and they were going, and you'd look up there, sort of think how close they are, and they're gone. No further involvement.
Did you ever see the results of you ordering an airstrike or the firing that was taking place?
I've seen results, not me personally ordering an airstrike, but I've seen it at Fire Support Base Anderson, what was out the front, and the injuries are offensive, and they're traumatic. High explosive does very horrible things to people, and then if you add the sort of traumatic amputation aspects, with shrapnel and high explosive and just bullets, they blow large holes in people, and it's very offensive. I saw the result. One time we got called out, and sometimes I have these sort of memories without context. I've got no idea, where the pre or the post is. But, looking, I think it was an artillery intelligence sort of thing, looking at an armoured personnel carrier, which is an ARVN, which had gone over a 750 kilogram aerial bomb used as a landmine. And I looked at the inside that, and I think it probably had about half a dozen, maybe a dozen ARVN in there. And the injuries, well, it was really, it's very difficult to describe. I mean, they tried to clean it out, as best they could. But this armoured personnel carrier was lying on its side, and the crater was about 30 feet this side of it, and you could put a small house into the crater. It was during the wet season, so the ground was pretty soft, but it was it certainly had caused all sorts of horrible injury, pulverised the people inside that. but you know, it was just when we got there, it was sort of an hour after things were still smoking and still pretty smelly, but they'd got most of the remains, you know, out of this thing. But obviously, to sort of think, it was an uncommon event, you know, because I wasn't in infantry. More common in infantry and things like that. In artillery, you know, except at fire support base Coral, where I think it was 102 battery, came very close to being overrun and was sort of firing down open barrel sights and things like that. Well, they got a much more intimate view of those sorts of things. I didn't.
How does it affect you when you saw what you saw?
Oh, what I thought, sort of was, I suppose the first things is, you know, glad it's not me. Secondly is that how the brain can accommodate the indescribable. I think one of the most indescribable things I saw there was a B-52 strike on the long highs, and I was probably about 8 clicks from the strike, and all of a sudden this range of mountains, hills, were just covered in these rippling explosions, and you could see the air being concussed out of the way of each explosion sort of going off, hitting the top and then rippling down, and then after a period of time the noise sort of came to you over the distance of eight clicks, and you think, geez, you know, how about that? That's really something to see, you know. Another one of the disconnected memories is being out somewhere and an airstrike being called in, and the delivery system for that airstrike was a pair of F4 Phantoms. And they were bombing a target which I think would have been about 70 metres to my front, but slightly offside. But to see these things with no sound initially to come swooping down out of the sky, and then this rippling sound of the Gatling gun just sort of, you know, renting through, and then what appeared to be just over our heads, these aircraft just turning on their tails and sort of taking off of the heavens again, and then the sound just following it. Just sort of, it was quite remarkable. And then the detonation of the bombs. I mean, it really, you hear it right through your body. It's not just your head. It just, it's hard to describe. And we were sort of low to the ground, but you could feel it, you know, this concussion sort of moving through the air. It's sort of like getting if you can imagine, if you had a very broad stick and you had a pillow and you just whack that pillow with all your might at that point of contact with the stick and the pillow, and then amplify it orally. It's something like that.
The sounds of war, and especially when you're firing the big guns.
Yeah.
How do you physically, what effect does that have on you?
That's a good question. I'm not too sure how. I know it's got to have an effect. As I said, when I first arrived there, I knew they switched on. These guns fired, around, and, you know, sort of jumped. And after a few weeks, you know, and you can sleep through these things. So what? You know, you just they're firing a firing mission. Z off again, you know. But sometimes, and sometimes I'll be there, and you could actually watch the shells leaving the barrels of the 105s, and you know, it'll be crashing your ears. And then you add it to the helicopters flying around, and I don't know. It certainly ruins my night's sleep, you know, in terms of trying to get off to sleep and those sorts of things. But I don't know. I suppose physiologically, I think your middle ear becomes, you know, quite sus after a little while with that. Nord knows what it's like to ingest, you know, lungfuls of cordite and other, you know, strange volatile chemical mixtures and things like that. I think yet to be found out in many ways.
Did they provide any ear protection at
No.
all?
No, not at all. I find it surprising now, the occupational health and safety. The old occupational health and safety officer would be going purple. No, not at all. And that's what I can remember when I was down at 3-1 Delta and these 8-inch SPs. Well, these things had 32-foot long barrels on them, so they were huge calibre weapons. And these double cracks, of sound barrier renting over the top of your head, it was quite. It's like being hit with something. Yeah.
Seems a bit strange considering they would have gone through World War One and Two, and they would have had people that obviously suffered ear damage, and still in the 1960s they.
I mean, they well, when we went through Canungra, they had boots that didn't, which were, similar, the same pattern boot as they had in 1916, more or less. Yes.
Very strange. Yeah. Did you feel a sense of power with these guns at all?
Paradoxically, yeah, but you also found out that you were very vulnerable to incoming, it's a paradoxical see. Yes, you are, but don't get carried away with it because you can become, quite vulnerable because you can't move anywhere really, things like that. I think Americans in self-propelled guns found themselves quite vulnerable because these M109s, SPs, 155 SPs. They drive them out into the field, fire off a few rounds, spend the night there, and they found out the Vietnamese have ringed them in a minefield. So you got to get out of your gun, and so people start shooting at you. So it's very much a two-edged sword. Those sorts of things.
The command structure around, how did you find that?
Look, in our own unit, we had what we call a battery captain. We had a major, 2 lieutenants, 2 sergeants, 3 sergeants, maybe half a dozen full bombardiers, another maybe half dozen lance jacks by myself, like myself. That was about it, really. The upper echelons of colonels and the task force commander. I think I saw I don't think I ever saw the task force commander. I forget which one who it is. Might have been CMI Pearson. I'm not too sure. There's something we're familiar with. So the Australian Army always works on small unit level. The highest that most any digger will see, more often than not, would be a lieutenant colonel. They'd have to be there'd have to be a tour group going around with a general. But the highest they'd ever see would be a lieutenant colonel. But quite often they'd be seeing majors. The company commander, but the person who is the one who is the everything is the battery sergeant major, company sergeant major. They're the ones who are in direct contact and make the things run. Yeah.
So how much discipline was there on the battlefield?
I think the discipline was quite outstanding, actually. Quite outstanding. Command and control of battlefield, even at the sub-unit level, let alone the sort of strategic macro level, was always very, very difficult. And why I add to that is that I read the story of the Battle of Long Tan, which is pretty heavy stuff. But when that platoon got isolated, say it was 11 platoon, it could have been 8 platoon, got isolated, and David Sabin, who was the lieutenant of the other platoon, had to do a tactical manoeuvre under fire, heavily outnumbered, in the pouring rain, to change his line of advance to help go and relieve the other platoon. And considering that radio comms would have been very dicky at best, it was pretty outstanding. I mean, there were some cock-ups with the holding up of the APCs for some reason, things like that. But that manoeuvre of Sabin's platoon to try and help the stranded platoon, I think was an outstanding feat of command and control. And the Australians were very well versed in small infantry tactics. You knew, then I come back to Canungra, you knew, heaven forbid, I never got caught in an ambush. But the Australian Army defined what an ambush was for you. You could only ever get ambushed from the left or the right. That's how they defined it. And so what were your choices? Well, the choices are, if you go to ground, in the killing ground, in an ambush, you're going to die. That's it. So the only solution to that is that if you can identify whether the ambush, and we spent hours doing ambush left, ambush right, now I know why. Once you identified where the ambush was coming from, and if the country is close, so the ambush can only be initiated no more than, say, 10 metres away, because I won't be able to see you anyway. If you charge that ambush with vigour, you stand a much better chance of getting through than going to ground in the killing ground. And I understand in reading after action reports that the Vietnamese, or the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese, were mightily surprised by this particular tactic. Because generally the tactic is to go to ground and try to outflank, but the Australian Army taught you to charge an ambush. And if you get through those first couple of metres without getting killed, the chances that you'd be amongst them. Contacts were different. Contact could only happen at the front or the rear of a section. And the tactics were that if you're in a contact, well, they can only contact the forward scout. I mean, even if they let the forward scout sort of get through, then it sort of becomes an ambush, so it changes again. So what would happen is that the gun group would always move to the right, or if there was high ground, always to high ground, and you would then get a flanking manoeuvre to go through, which was tactics the Japanese used and the Australians learned a lot from in New Guinea. And they were the dynamic presentations of those particular things, which were completely outside the repertoire of the Americans, I understand. They had no idea about those sorts of tactical situations could be defeated.
Just on that, were there actual World War II guys at this point, or they had a big influence in the training from New Guinea and so on?
Oh yeah, and there were some outstanding soldiers from that period. There was a bloke who was known to our family, or my father, Sir Major Percy White, who was RSM of 4th 19th Prince of Wales Light Horse there at one stage. He won a Silver Star in Vietnam, as well as a distinguished conduct medal, and he was World War II Armoured Corps and was with the Australian Army advisory team. Oh yeah, these blokes were the bearers of the knowledge. And as I said, the Australian Army up until that point was a very pretty small group. I mean, there were certain things where the Australian Army lacked. I mean, it hadn't been since Tobruk or thereabouts, or where you get large-scale formations of infantry associated with tanks. I mean, Vietnam was the first time tanks had been employed using infantry tank cooperation. Strange word, at the beginning it was very, very difficult. How do you move tanks through close country with infantry nearby without either shooting them or running over them? And they learnt these lessons very, very quickly.
Did commanders and so on become less pedantic about what they were enforcing on the battlefield?
I can't answer that. The most important person on the battlefield, because it was a section, platoon, company sort of thing, were the platoon commanders. And the next line up from the platoon commander was the company commander, and he'd take his 4 platoon commanders. He knew the individual personal characteristics of each, and each would be allotted the whole idea, I suppose, tactically was on the ground. You'd move in and you'd clear a grid square. And once you cleared that grid square, you go clear another grid square. That was the general line of advance that you're going through, whatever the purpose overall. All right, so you've cleared every grid square at the end of six weeks, and you come back 6 months later and you go through the same exercise again. But I think small infantry tactics and things like that were pretty well, it was pretty much left to to very well trained, though inexperienced, platoon commanders who became even better trained and even more experienced within a short period of time. And this is sort of reinforced by the maturity. When you think that the average platoon commander was probably about 22 years of age, but his experience was how expanded by whoever his platoon sergeant was, who was quite old and could have been, will be on his second tour of Vietnam, or may have in fact served in infantry in Korea or up on Borneo during the confrontation.
From what you're saying, it sounds like the Australians were very systematic and in control of the situation. Is that right? Or?
I think so. Look, I'm sure errors were made, and probably it's sort of interesting. You read some of the histories that say the role of the task force commanders and how various units were either utilised, and the particular vision of the task force commander, certainly had its impact. But coming down to the unit level where things had to be done, I think they got done, pretty well. I find it interesting, say, my own role in that. I was one step up, the ladder, looking at myself in retrospect, remarkably immature at the time. But that said, I had no doubts about what I was expected to do, and I also had no doubts that I would in fact do. And that was, that's the way it was.
That must be a bit of a good frame of mind to be going into things like this.
Oh, I think so. It's like I said, back at that very first sort of contact back there at Fire Support Base Anderson, of when the mortars go, and I got rebuffed by gunner bins, get out of here. But when I look back in retrospect, in the Australian Army, they have this term, advance into contact. As soon as I heard that mortar come out, I was, laced the boots up, got the weapon, and advanced towards the fire, not away from it, and then sort of found out that I was a spare leg, and then got back into my pit, and I had the luxury, I suppose, at that time, where it was only a matter of, do I become involved? I'd already become involved in sort of going towards the pit, but what do I do next? Well, I'm told to bugger off, and rightly so, there was no room for me there. And then I became involved, and it was very much a conscious choice. Now, there are certain issues I would like to change if I could, with some of my interpersonal reactions, especially when some degree of conflict. 5 blokes or 4 blokes together, sharing, not so much sharing pits, but sharing responsibilities and things like that, and dealing with certain, personality issues. I think, in retrospect, I handled some of them not badly, but I could have done better. And I would also think amongst my colleagues, some people may have thought I was an idiot, so, I was certainly reinforced that when I was pissed, there's no doubt about that. But at the end of the day, I was the Lance Jack in charge. And that was it.
What responsibilities did you have as being in charge?
To do my duty and the things like that, and whatever the job description was to ensure that not only did I do my duty, that the other 4 blokes did theirs. It's as simple as that. And that was, be on shift, don't be pissed on shift, get it right. those sorts of things. Weapons were always, in the housekeeping aspects. Now I didn't sort of go out. I didn't expect that I would have to carry out a weapons inspection, amongst my boat. But if one didn't work, that was essentially my responsibility. Yeah, and the blokes were informed. It was my job to go to the O groups, pass on any unpleasantness. I'm looking for volunteers. Famous last words, you and you, come with me. We're going to fill sandbags. Isn't that wonderful? We're going to dig a latrine. Isn't that fantastic? Great. Or get your rifle, get your kit. We're going out, and that just happened on occasion where I was told to pick up two blokes, and I went with them, and I met up with a sergeant, and we went somewhere.
When you're in command, as you are, can you be friends with the people you're in command of?
That was never fully tested. It was tested once. It wasn't fully tested. I had one digger pull a rifle on another, and I thought to myself at that moment, would I be justified in shooting him? It was a conscious thought. Inside a tent, can you imagine? What it'd be like. But it was a tense sort of situation, and the person who had pulled the rifle was ordered to put it down. Not please. And the way it was to be put down was actually graphically described. But I must say that I was never really, because Australians get on with one another. I mean, this is the other advantage too. They tend to get on with one another, so that sort of helps. Yeah.
Did you find it hard yourself being in control of other people? Or?
I did actually. It's a thing which injects fear, and that's. But I don't know what they saw in me, why I should have been promoted, and I was not the only. Things would pity give me if I was the only contender, and I was promoted back here in Australia well before I went overseas. So I just turned 18. So somebody saw a potential in that. And as I mentioned earlier, I mean, most of my peers were blokes. I was just out of school. There were blokes, there were blokes, who, national servicemen who would say deferred. They were electricians, plumbers, real estate, dealing with real estate salesmen in the army. Hell, it's difficult at times. But somebody, and I didn't lose my stripe. I could have, just with because that's one stripe is not a promotion; it's an appointment, so it can be taken off you at the whim of the battery sergeant major, and it didn't happen. So somebody thought that I had the potential to do it correctly, even though I had sort of bombed badly in my radar course. I was a complete dope at that, but I was standing under the heading of Luddite here. But in terms of, I suppose, aspects of leadership, I thought, I got overseas and I got home, still as Lance Bombardier. Not great, but
Do you think you were promoted too quickly at that?
Not for me to say. No, because I stuck it through. I didn't essentially fail at that position. So I would think, I was really, when I think about it, what I sort of know now, because I've worked for many years in charge positions, But that held me in very good stead for what my post-military career was all about. about those sorts of things. But they must have thought I was as green as grass there at certain times. There's no doubt about that.
With the conscripts, what was the relationship like?
I think it was very good. I mean, there was, what was it? Banter, shaking, that sort of thing, but it was good. It was very good. I mean, I think I was more often than not referred to as some sort of, what do they call them? A regular army clown. Came the retort from the Nasho. But our unit must have been, 70% national service. There was no, it didn't mean anything other than a title at the time.
Did other regulars give them a hard time or anything, or?
I didn't observe it. Not from a if somebody was being discriminated against it because they were a dill, not because they were a Nasho or a reg. It's as simple as that. I mean, what were those, famous retorts? Come here, shit for brains. This is, this was, and as I go back to the earlier days, more often than not, it was really straight down the line. I didn't find anything in all that particularly nasty. That's what you got. Whereas I find, in these portrayals of American things, they really are, how those DIs get through the day without having their heads blown off, because they would in Australia. If somebody spoke to you like that, you'd be detonated. You just couldn't get. You just couldn't. You and your mates would really sort of, do a number on somebody like that. It's just not different. Yards apart, miles apart.
Do you think some of that is just the inherent humour in when Australians say things to each other and so on?
It's a lot of it. I wish I had a memory for snippets of conversation. I really do, but I don't. Some of it's very funny. Oh, that's right. And some of it's so droll. I mean, it was pretty dry, sort of, pretty kid stuff, I remember standing on parade at School of Artillery at North Head, doing guard duty. And School of Artillery sort of prides itself about giving that little bit extra, you remember you're in artillery, not a rabble. And standing there, I could feel the I think it was Sergeant Major Donkin, MBE, who had been with the advisory team, and Don, I was going to say, how dare I, Sergeant Major Donald Donkin, big bloke. And I can remember him cruising up behind me. I was sort of standing there and just breathing on the back of my neck, doing the inspection. I remember him sort of saying, "Am I hurting you, soldier?" So, I ought to be, soldier. Why, sir? Because I'm standing on your bloody hair shoulder. Get a haircut. It was delivered, it was in the delivery. And those sorts of things with it. Yeah.
Did you see any conscript who found it hard to adjust to the situation they're being sort of thrown into?
No, because whatever the system was, most people who were not suitable were out by the time recruit training had finished. And there were some rough nuts. There's no doubt about that. I can remember one bloke who tore up the parade ground at the School of Artillery on his motorbike. But, and there were some, really sort of, and I can remember one bloke telling one sergeant that it would not be a good idea for him to go to sleep at night. But it passed over. I think it was fairly rare in many times. Yeah.
I guess I think you said there was 70% Nashos.
Look, it could have been. Look, some units were practically all national service, basically. The NCO cadres and officer cadres. Well, even the officers at the end, a lot of national service officers. I think in some infantry companies, all 4 of the platoon commanders could well be national service.
You wouldn't know, would you? Because unless they'd said something or someone else knew something about someone,
It didn't matter.
if they kept their mouth shut, you don't know what they are.
I mean, you were essentially baggy asses. One of the common vernacular there. Oh, and apart when they pointed a finger at you, calling you a dickhead rig or an army clown. But no, it was not. I think it's only sort of an issue in terms from outside observers are saying that that conscription. It was essentially a national service. Well, I think it was pretty well a national service army. In fact, I got a surprise. I went back to the School of Arty some years after I got out of the army, and I'd just sort of seen at how it had shrunk again to being a regular army. I mean, it was a real machine, just turning over courses, air wing, gunnery wing, radar wing, and all these sorts of things. So people were too busy, far too busy. To sort of make these sort of distinctions, which are irrelevant in the doing of the thing anyway.
Do you think? Can you tell us a bit about checking IDs and so on at the checkpoints and what your role was there?
Look, it sort of a quasi paramilitary role, and it was also something to do to break the boredom too, sitting up on top of the horseshoe. But we were to check IDs, yes, and Nguyen Van Nguyen, is it, and Hook from White, friends of fame, it was a charade, because what even made more of a charade, I mean, we had regional forces people there. They were all sort of sitting down playing cards, giggling and smoking cigarettes. Of course they would have known who was coming through the checkpoint, and if they had have known that there was a heavy-duty Viet Cong coming through, they wouldn't have let us know. If they wanted, quiet life, and they would have just passed through, not in a wink, that sort of thing. Not unless it was payback time or, something like that. And there was one incident down there going down to the checkpoint one morning, and this bloke come out of the bunker, went down to, they had these sort of barbed wire barricades, which they'd put across the road, and somebody had put a landmine down there and blew him up. But that could have been anything. But it was an interesting thing to see on the way down. It's there's sort of the odd things that sort of come to mind.
Through training and while you're there and you're doing this checkpoint work. And you mentioned earlier about the one with the batteries and so on. How hard and what did they teach you about this distinguishing the enemy? There
wasn't any. The enemy was somebody who looked like a Vietnamese who was carrying a rifle, AK-47, an SKS, an RPD, an RPG-2, RPG-7. They wore a conical hat, and they had Ho Chi Minh sandals. So if you put the weapons away, that's every person doing their bit for the national liberation. I mean, things got really. It was very bad. I mean, the civil wars are just nasty because there is good cause, so to speak, at every sort of strata of society. I mean, one time Cosvin, the NLF, they targeted in the sort of the Marxist sense the intellectuals, the school teacher, the bureaucrat. They were assassinated and things like that, or tortured and then assassinated, and their family be tortured and then assassinated, and these sorts of things, definitely went on. But it was as part of the tragedy of competing political factions within a civil situation. And the fact of the matter is, when they what was it? It wasn't the 38th parallel. That's Korea. When they put that arbitrary line north of Hue, I mean, there was supposed to be free and open elections in Vietnam in 1954 or 1955. And if they had been, Ho Chi Minh would have won. There's no doubt about that. And yeah, Ho Chi Minh would have been a communist. Oh yeah. But I tell you what, the Vietnamese are into free enterprise. So it would have been very much like Italian communism had its own particular style. Vietnamese communism, I'm quite sure, as a government, would have had its own particular style, and I don't think it would have been Stalinist Marxist. I mean, Vietnamese history is not about Stalinist Marxism. It's about heroes, tyrants, the role of women. The Trung sisters, and these are great Vietnamese heroes, and it's not about that. And they know what it's like to overthrow tyranny. They're the only colony of China to get rid of the Chinese. Fantastic.
You say it's a civil war. Did you feel that at the time when you're in there?
Yeah, I had the first inklings of it when I arrived at Ton Son Nhut. It hadn't crystallised. But it crystallised during my time at the Horseshoe. And I met a bloke, this bloke I said who'd been with the French against the Viet Minh.
Mm.
I think I met him at Ap Sui Ne, which is sort of a strange little village north of Nui Dat. And we were talking, he spoke pretty good English, I spoke appalling French. And we didn't even know what a Vietnamese alphabet looked like. But anyway, he and I just had a chat, over a cigarette and things like that. And he put it into perspective for me I was going to go somewhere at the end of a year. He was already home, and he had sort of traditionally he was going to be for the government and the offshoot of the colonial government, which tended to be, the puppet government. He was not a Viet Cong. No doubt he would have gone into, if he wasn't killed, as most likely he was, but he would have been part of the great payback resettlement sort of repression that occurred in Vietnam after 1975. I have no doubt about that. But he was pretty accepting of his lot and had a sort of a world weariness about him, and he was a very decent chap.
Were your views back then around the camp, or what did the other soldiers think of the situation?
I don't think it was ever really expressed. Part of it being a prick of a place. I was being polite there too. That was about it. Leave it to the Vietnamese. I mean, you used to hear things. Why don't they just bomb the country to smithereens, pull a plug, let the country sink 6'2", and you would have drowned every bastard Vietnamese in the place. These sorts of comments and things like that. But that said, I got a niggling suspicion amongst some, and I don't have any strong evidence for this. You could not but help admire the resilience. There used to be a sort of a country myth about the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and that this poor bastard is conscripted. He leaves North Vietnam with 2 mortars in his pack. He walks the whole length of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, gets down to just outside Saigon, and they fire his 2 mortars. That's it, and then somebody shoots him. Strange, it's a strange story, but that's. I think they were fighting for their country, which is pretty good motivation.
When you start to think it's a civil war and you're in the middle of it, does it affect the way you handle your job?
Yes. It puts a different perspective to it. It certainly doesn't, it would not lessen what I had to do, because the whole issue is about my survival and my mate's survival. It has, that is still the number one priority. And once you get a realisation of this, you pull a shutter down, and you leave that in an isolated corner of your head, not to be visited too often, but knowing that this is not a very comfortable thing to be quite aware of at the time. And this is where Smoke in the Dope helped, because at least it illuminated that shutter that it was actually there. Whereas I think if I had to continue with the alcohol, all it would have done is just sort of source the brain. Really. Excuse me.
No, that's fine.
That's why I have
That's
the
okay.
German version here. Yeah,
That's fine.
yeah.
Did a lot of the guys disregard the political and the moral and the social implications and just say they're doing their job?
Yep. We're here. 280 in a wakey. That's it. 280, 79 in a wakey. That's it. And fuck everybody else. Yep. And when's the next letter from home coming? They want to get out. I don't think there was any real sort of. Well, there certainly weren't any sort of book discussions, or group therapy sessions about it. That's for sure. And I can't really remember. The typical. When Jim Menz got killed, I don't know if there was any real comment about that at all. Now, my memory might be playing tricks with me, but I'm trying to remember that next morning where there was cigarettes and light-hearted banter and going out and having the bodies up front and things like that, and I'm trying to get organised in my head what the hell had happened that night. And I don't think anybody mentioned Jim, and yet he's become memorialised as being the Jim Men's Club at 131 now, surveillance targeting an acquisition battery, and these sort of strange homages and honourings. But I don't really remember anybody sort of making comment. There was some comment about the circumstances of them being killed, but it was brief and transitory. And in fact, there's probably more comment about Dutchy Van Driel, and I don't even know how badly. He was certainly badly enough injured to get returned to Australia. But nobody could give you any sort of chapter and verse. I've got no idea what happened to his personal belongings back in Nui Dat or anything like that. This is the other thing about the war there, I think, is that once you were knocked out of combat, you ceased to exist for your mates. You were seen disappearing into a helicopter somewhere, and that was it. That was it, and you're back to Australia, which is a bit. Maybe it wasn't any different from getting brassed up on the Somme, but Vietnam, it just sort of the curtain just sort of closed sideways behind you, and nobody really took any depths. And I think it would have been at one's own personal peril to explore that.
You mentioned the wake in the days and so on. A guy lands, how quickly does he want to come home? On that first day or 20 days in?
No, it's the first day. Because what you hear is that, how long have you got to go? 365 away. You say, nobody's got that long. And then the next comment is, you'll be sorry. You'll be sorry. One of the first words I sort of heard there, and it was about a bloke transiting out, catching probably that 707 the next morning to fly back to Australia, or that night to fly back to Australia.
Was that a traditional thing to say that?
You'll be sorry. Oh, yeah.
Because we've heard that from World War II guys.
Yeah, you'll be sorry. Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of World War II, when you're in the middle of Vietnam, putting into context, do you think about the guys of World War II and what they went through, or do you think this is a completely different, this is my war?
My war. Even though you know that you've got a reputation to uphold. Anzac. It's pretty solid. We used to corrupt it a bit as being Bronze Axe or something like that, but Anzac was the thing to uphold. And the whole idea, your failure of character would be letting your mates down. You could start in all sorts of directions at once, but if you let your mates down, this would be, I think, considered failure. And it worked the other way. I mean, irrespective of, say, whatever prickly relations I may have had, which were transitory, I mean, they weren't serious, I was under no illusion at any time if the shit hit the fan, we would, it's very Christian in that sort of, in that you know, what is it, was it John 23, I think, you know, for the religious minded, greater love hath no man, this sort of thing. Now, I don't think people there are talking about love in any shape or form. It's not a word you use in a war zone all that often. But the whole idea, look, I saw on that road outside the Horseshoe where that bloke had been killed, you know, I saw blokes moving up and supporting one another. They didn't have to, but they did. You know, and the way the cigarette sort of came along the line and all that. You know, not a big startling thing, but it was just a little thing, and nobody was under any doubt that we were there for each other. And if it meant closing and killing the enemy, that's what you were trained to do and paid to do. Meaning which the pay was lousy. I'm still angry about that. $110 a week for a grade 3, $110 a fortnight for a grade 3 Lance Bombardier, tax-free, all allowances, $110.
That include danger money or?
That was it.
That was it.
That was the full kick and caboodle.
Just another question on World War II. World War II was largely a black and white war. You
Yeah.
see photos and so on.
Yeah.
When you're actually in there, and it's hard to, was it hard to relate to those black and white photos?
They were irrelevant. And the whole idea of, I mean, Nui Dad was in the front line. It was surrounded. You couldn't go anywhere without being surrounded by the front line. There was no front line, there was no back line or anything. It was all there. The little kids watching you know, doing this with that. How do you know that they're not counting, you know, the number of troops in the back of a truck heading down to Berea, and you know the message is going, you know, there's a truck on its way with 10 people, and they're not particularly alert. You know, maybe, you know, Uncle Two should get his RPG out and take a pot shot. You know, I'm fantasising here a little bit, but I just don't know how far about that. You know, there was no. You're in somebody else's country. There was no, and the whole idea of advance where? You went and, you know, what did a fire support base advance on? It didn't advance anywhere, and one of the poignant, useless exercises of the whole fucking show is that you'd be at one of these fire support bases, you know, the guns would be operating, and these blokes working, you know, and it's hard, back-breaking physical labour. The grunts are out the front, you know, or wherever, hard physical labour, getting bits of them, you know, sort of, you know, taken off, and then this, that, and the other, and then after some arbitrary time, it's filling your pits. Somebody sets up a charge at the CP, that gets blown up, the trains get covered in, the guns get picked up and taken away, and all is this sort of circle. And then you'd move on to another one.
I got a question about the Tet Offensive as well. How much of a surprise was it when it happened?
To the Australians, not a big surprise. To the Americans, an awfully big surprise. I've read about it. Australian intelligence actually, you know, really did a great job there. And there was one American general who was switched on, and this led to the Australians moving into Benue Province and things like that. But the whole idea that you had the old imperial capital, you know, being seized, and of course, you know, NVA and VC inside the American embassy in Sargon, you know, it was ridiculous. it was huge, and I don't know if I've got this right, but I witnessed a detonation on the night that signalled the Tet Offensive, and I don't know whether it was the reserve ammunition dump or the reserve fuel dump at Benoit going off. What an explosion. And we were about 5.5, maybe 7 clicks from Benoit, and there was this God almighty, and it just lit up the whole sky. And then the sound eventually came to us. And there were hundreds of North Vietnamese killed at Benoit, and thousands, all over the country. And then after the end of the initial sort of assaults and the things that happened in Berea and things like that, where 3 Battalion got blooded and things like that, then the retributions by the cadres on the local people for not supporting the North Vietnamese. It was truly terrible. And what else happened? Oh yeah, it wasn't until long that Cambodia happened. And the great irony of it is that you had these rumblings between Nixon and Kissinger regarding the proposed Paris peace talks. That was the other thing happening in 1968. It was a strange irony.
When peace talks and things are happening, did you know about them?
Yeah. I mean, we were getting news. I mean, and you got and I was thinking, I know I was out in the sticks, and news of this was coming on, but also news of the American incursion in force into Cambodia through the Parrots Peak, if I remember correctly. Well, it's very strange.
Even though earlier you said there was a bit of a system and you felt pretty grounded, it sounds like, in the Australian operations. Yes. What chaos was there in your war?
For me, not much. Making a real sense of it, I suppose, when you realise that you're involved in the Civil War and all the politics. But only I had one night of chaos, sort of chaos actually. It was after the attack on Fire Support Base Anderson. We got reinforced and things like that, and they brought up these killing machines called M40 Dusters, which are these tank tracks with twin 40mm anti-aircraft guns on, used as an anti-personnel sort of thing. They were in there, and I think it was and for me what happened this night, because nobody had told us, and I damn near died actually, is that they put an H&I fire into where that mortar place is, but not where the mortar was, but the whole line of trees. And the next thing, these salvos or batteries of artillery started impacting, and nobody had given anybody. Somebody might have known what was going on, but I certainly didn't. And they just, one round after another, hammering in and thinking, oh, I wish they'd stop, and having no control, absolutely no control over that. And then I think it was that night, or maybe the next night, something, probably a mongoose or something like, tripped a flare. Fizz. And the whole side of the fire support base opened up in what they call a yippee shoot, firing at nothing. And this continued for some time, but absolute nothing. And so chaos for me was always kept at bay because I was never really exposed. I mean, the whole idea of, say, being in an infantry contact with significant, casualties around you, out of radio comms, and trying to work out which is north, which is south, and that sort of thing. I never had was never put to that challenge.
Just to give people a sense, we can never really understand what it's like to be there, but just to have a sense, what films have you seen that sort of are close to the experience?
There's only one, and that's The Odd Angry Shot. The rest, it's American angst. The Odd Angry Shot's got some angst in it too, but at least it's Australian angst, and I think that sort of gets Gets down to it a bit. Yeah.
When you say the American Acts, it was just a different war for them, or those films don't represent it at all, or what's your
Well, if they do, it's a pretty awful war. I mean, if they really... You look at Platoon. Just imagine having those as your mates. You know, really. How could you function? You couldn't. You couldn't, and hopefully they weren't functioning like that. Or if you you look at what was Platoon sort of six. What was another one of the sort of Full Metal Jacket? Well, yeah, that was really. I don't think that was representative per se of it was representative of a different reality, which is an awful reality. But again, where you see the brutalisation of that recruit who sort of turned, I mean, you couldn't imagine that. You know, that happened. What army would allow things for that? You know, I mean, what sort of shit for brains is that? Is that drill sergeant? You know, how can that be? I don't know.
About the Arvin and the Green Berets, how were they considered amongst Australians? Well, if you do it block by block.
Let's say the Arvin
Yeah.
first. The general consensus that the Arvin was useless.
What were the reasons for that?
There was no reason. I suppose if you tend to explore that, is that why were these there if the Arvin couldn't sort of deal with it? Okay, but there was generally a very low opinion of the Vietnamese armed forces. And I think this is probably generated essentially through ignorance. It's just probably as simple as that. And the other thing too, that I think part of the political situation sort of would help with that, because there were certain Arvin units who were basically part of, you know, how will I say, warlord establishments and political establishments who were there just to essentially enhance aspects of power. But amongst the, you know, generally amongst the Australians, the Arvin were not seen as a viable fighting force, even though in reality there were certain Arvin units which certainly were, and especially I think up in certain areas in the north, and also down around the Delta, I think, but generally the Australian opinion of it. Because the other thing, we didn't have very much to do with them, and treated Arvin with suspicion, because we did have Arvin interpreters with, you know, in certain units, but they were we didn't have much. I mean, conceivably, you could have gone through Vietnam and never seen a Vietnamese. It's a long shot, but conceivable. Let's say if you were posted to Saigon, I mean, you know, you would see Vietnamese on scooters and cyclos and things like that, but it would certainly not be seen essentially in a war sort of situation. Same goes, I suppose, aspects of Vung Tau. Arvin on the military base would be seen as domestics.
So they were always seen as being subservient. Well, they really were, weren't
They were.
Even into the command structure.
Yeah.
So they weren't really running their own affairs.
Absolutely not. It was run by MACV, Military Assistance Command Vietnam.
Which is the American command.
Yep. They ran the show. And the show, I guess, was run out of General Westmoreland's mansion. I don't know what Westmoreland lived in when he was in Vietnam, but I'm sure it wasn't a tent. I don't know.
How was he considered amongst Australians? You must have heard his name quite often.
Oh yeah, he was the American commander in South Vietnam, you know. But sort of interesting. If you asked Australians, say during the second, if you had have asked Australians, say during the Second World War, you know, who are the senior American commanders and who were the senior British commanders, and this, they could have, at least 4 names. If you ask the average Australian in Vietnam who are the American commanders, well, they could have named Westmoreland. Who else after that?
Okay. Green Berets, of course. Now, the reason why I asked you about these 2 questions was that obviously the horseshoe incident was very important. It was a defining point.
Yeah.
It seems that what you say.
Yeah.
And the behaviour of the Arvin and the Green Berets in that incident seems to relate to some bigger issues with the Green Berets and the Arvin.
They just happened to be an Arvin and a Green Beret. I mean, he was the call sign. He was the regional advisor, and he had his equivalent Arvin sidekick with him, and it just happened that he was a Green Beret. I mean, he could have been a Marine. Yeah, he wasn't, but could have been a Marine. It just turned out to be a Green Beret, that's all.
What about the Green Berets?
John Wayne was a Green Beret, wasn't he?
Well, so he thought.
Yeah. One of the strange things about Vietnam were the pictures you could see. Great films came out in 1968. Bonnie and Clyde sort of comes to mind. The Good, the Bad and the Ugly sort of comes to mind. And the Green Berets sort of came to mind. I can remember being shown there at Nui Dat and to howls of derision.
Sorry?
Howls of derision. And I think the closing shot, if I remember correctly, in the Green Beret is the sun setting over the sea. There's nowhere in Vietnam you can see the sun set over the sea, and Vietnam points east.
Well, people noticed that, didn't they?
Well, I did anyway. I wasn't the only one that noticed that the sun setting over the sea. How can you? How can it be?
But that was a controversial film, actually.
Oh,
A lot of people were pretty upset about that.
I would think so. I mean, it gave the, how will I say, the John Birch Society view of why we should be in Vietnam, and we were liberating, the democratic, freedom-loving South Vietnamese from the terrible tyranny of the communists.
What are the changes that took place in you after the horseshoe incident? Or incidents, rather?
I think there was both a physical and a spiritual change. I became, physically stroke spiritually stroke emotionally more locked down. I became very tired and I became more and more preoccupied with wanting to come home. I wanted to leave the country behind. I wanted to go away.
Did you lose faith in the cause by then?
The only cause I had, even prior to then, the only cause was is that to get through the year, do the best you can, and then go home. And this just sort of reinforced that motivation or that goal.
When you joined the regular army, did you have in your mind that you wanted to serve in Vietnam?
Well, it's it was sort of the gold medal event, for an army. I mean, nobody goes into the army voluntarily, to sort of stack blankets and not be engaged in some sort of test of your motivation and your training.
So that was a big part of your motivation to join?
Well, because Vietnam's really hadn't cranked up. I joined up in 1966. There was 1 battalion, maybe 2 battalions there. It certainly wasn't level. I mean, we knew where we were going to go after recruit training, but the whole thing didn't unshackle until late 67, 68. But to have felt that you would have missed out in going, well, what was the use of being in the army?
So did you, at the time, we'll say up until the time you started changing your views about the war, did you subscribe to the domino theory, forward defence?
No, not particularly. I was aware of it, but my zeal was not so much in terms of the politic, but as to sort of prove myself as a soldier, and that particular I didn't I never. So looking back in retrospect, it's hard to say, but I never had that sort of frame of mind of fight them over there rather than here, because even then I was aware it'd be probably, if you're going to fight anybody anywhere, it's probably best to do it in your own country where you've got control of the population, of the topography, the resources and the knowledge. I mean, really, that would be ideal. Fair enough, you can do it away, okay, but if you can't, your own backyard's the best backyard to be in, and the Vietnamese proved that.
What about communism? How did you view communism, before you went to Vietnam and during your stay there?
I never had a firm view. Look, I knew it sort of, had grown up with the idea of communism, but for me it was essentially a name. It didn't sort of carry any particular resonance, even though I knew that they were sort of anti-Catholic atheists, and that when I was a kid it was going to be a fight. Well, you see, I didn't even really see it as a fight between the communists and the Americans. I saw it would have been a fight between the Russians and the Americans. And they may have had a communist, I didn't articulate this in my own head, but I never saw every Russian as a communist. I saw most Russians as being Russian, but they just happened to have a communist government. So I never really had a sort of a fixed political view on that. It's probably become more fixed, in retrospect, but not at the time.
And the differences between the Australian contingents there at the time, you can draw a line certainly between the regulars and the Nashos.
Oh, I don't think you can.
Why is that?
Because it was an integrated force. There was the only difference between a national serviceman and a regular was in their dog tag number. That was the only difference.
What about in mentality?
No, exactly the same.
Other vets think that there were differences in.
Oh, as I said earlier, I mean, if you were called an army clown or a dickhead reg, it'd be a national serviceman talking to you. But I didn't. You didn't. You're on a gun line or something like that, or you're laying out. You don't say, "Oh, are you a Nasho?" "Oh, I think I'll move over a little bit." No, there was no difference. And as I said earlier, I'm not 100% sure of that, but I think some units were up to 70% national service. I mean, there was such a high proportion of units, that were made of national service. No, I didn't see any difference whatsoever. May have initially, when it was a bit new, and would they prove themselves, things like that. Well, the answer is yes. And they continued to do their duty as well as anybody.
While you were in Vietnam, I'm just curious to know how your observations, how you developed observations of the Vietnamese people altogether, their culture, their society, and how these observations changed throughout your tour.
Well, we didn't know anything about Vietnamese people when we arrived. Had no idea about that, and it's a strange thing. We're going there to sort of save them, and yet denigrate them at the same time. And it wasn't until I got to the Horseshoe and that I actually started to see Vietnamese people in a daily living existence, and started to have conversation with some of the popular forces people who were at that checkpoint. What a horrible position they were in, socially. Just a terrible position, trying to uphold a government, and yet they live in the village, which is supposedly VC sympathisers. I mean, it's sort of. Just hearing that term rankles me, because I don't know what a VC sympathise. It's as if they sort of changed allegiances in many ways to become a sympathiser. They never were for the government of South Vietnam in the first place. So they really, it was sort of an odd situation. And then learning, that You know, it was a 32. I think Vietnamese is a 32-letter alphabet with six different tones. You know, and how do the Australians describe a mob of Vietnamese talking? Sounds like ducks fucking. You know. Yeah, so if you bring a culture down to that, and then sort of learning, you know, from these people that, you know, that it's a very, you know, I was interested that it was, you know, a tremendously old culture. It was unique. Their writing, their language, you know, it's unique, and things like that, and how only in a very limited snapshot or a very narrow spectrum, that family ties and alliances within villages go back from generation to generation to generation. I was amazed of how they made their hats. You know, that took skill. They used to have, I'm not too sure what they were a rowboat that looked like an inverted bowl, woven, and a bloke would stand up there with his hat and his shorts, his sort of skinny torso, with a pole, and he would take this circular thing across the river. And I thought, you know, I couldn't do that. You know, that is real skill. And furthermore, he probably made that funny little boat and things like that. Mm.
Do you think most Australians who were there felt the same way?
No.
They didn't admire their ingenuity?
Only in terms of they saw ingenuity, I suppose, in terms of cunning and foiling our best efforts to defeat them. Probably in that particular context.
Yeah, so all the from that book, it seems that everyone admires them from a tactical sense.
Well, you had
their
to.
Grit.
How could you not?
Mm. But that seems to be the only observation.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting.
But I was just fascinated by their capacity for labour. You know, and that road at the Horseshoe, and you could spot a black-clad silhouette. You know, it's 700, 800 metres, and it'd be that wonderful rhythm coming to you, carrying, you know, nearly 80, 90 pounds of goods on one of these wooden yokes, and they've got this kinetic momentum bouncing towards you, and they get to you, and you stop them, and you can almost feel that energy sort of travel up the rifle barrels to your shoulder. You know, they've got and in such passive resistance, they'd put the stuff down. You'd take it, you check the soil. They wouldn't make eye contact. You know, word, and then they'd pick these things up, and you'd see them having to sort of try to recapture that rhythm that they'd had for the last 5Ks to get into that dough. You know, which is another 300 metres to go, or something like that, and the sparkling good humour of some of them, really, you know, and I was sort of, you know, I was impressed by that. And I think this was stimulated me by one particular Vietnamese bloke that I met. You know, that helped too. Nor did I have somebody close to me have their head blown off by, you know, a Vietnamese teenager either. I'm not sure if, you know, that had happened, my views would be somewhat different, but. I knew when I came away from the place, I would have to know more about this group of people who aren't Cambodians, who aren't Laotians, or they're not Chinese, they're Vietnamese.
What about the political differences within the Vietnamese themselves?
Well, I mean, there was definitely a ruling clique, and it was corrupt. I mean, that was very, very obvious. And it was also obvious that in order to survive in that country, you had to be able to turn a dollar. And the whole idea of Vietnamese and prostitution is a very difficult idea within the Vietnamese culture indeed. I don't know how many prostitutes there are in Vietnam today, but I'm damn sure there aren't many. They're just, you know, it's not, you know, quite a cultural norm for them, whether it is for any country. The, you know, very strong, you know, family traditions, and as I said, I mean, Vietnamese, South Vietnam is being run essentially by a despotic family, and then other pretenders to sort of to get into the presidential palace in Saigon, and it was the peasant that got it. He either got it from the Viet Cong, he got it from the North Vietnamese, he got it from us on land, sea and air, and had nowhere, I just don't know how they didn't, where do you go to escape that, if a COSVN or National Liberation recruiting cadre comes into your village and they say, we need rice, we need money, we need a place to stay. And you say, no, we don't want you here. So they cut your father's head off. And they said, we're staying. And then somebody in the village runs down the road, meets up with, this is a fantasy, but meets up with an Australian patrol and says there are Vietnamese in the village. So they do a cordon search. And then, what happens after that? It's very difficult.
During the Tet Offensive, from your point of view at the time, were you expecting something worse than what actually transpired?
Yeah. Could have been overrun, especially at Fire Support Base Harrison. I really don't know. They could have walked through us, dished us up with a mop and bucket. I don't see how we really could have defended that particular fire support base from anything, from any sort of attack. And I think my lucky stars, that it was out of there. Yeah. You see, the other thing is, you're looking down a tunnel. It's very, you're out in the sticks and things like that. You're not looking through a broad view of things. It's very narrow. What's going to happen, today, tomorrow, the next day, and things like that. So it's a very narrow focus indeed, and your focus is on sort of fairly basic needs, like keeping awake. When everything about you tells that you want to go to sleep. Not getting too upset with extraneous noise of artillery shells going off over the top of you. And then questioning yourself, what am I really doing here?
After your incident or your experience in Tet, I mean, the immediate days after your personal experience in a firefight or skirmish, you would have obviously heard the news that was happening around the country, the chaos.
It didn't come. No, look, there was. I don't think, because where could we hear it? We're an isolated bit of ground outside. We were just sort of hearing action reports, but really had no idea. Unless my memory, had absolutely no idea of the critical situation in Wei. I had no idea what had happened at Berea or Long Dien or places like that, or really, except there were attacks in Saigon. No, there was no sort of drawing it together, because there was nowhere you could hear that. We didn't have transistor radios or anything like that with us, so you just relied on what was coming out in the daily orders groups, which were really centred about what was happening in your sort of 5 kilometre, say, radius around that particular fire support base. We knew that things were happening, but no idea of the scale.
But in Phuoc Toi province, obviously it would have built each day. You would have realised that, okay, something big's happening. A lot of engagements taking place.
No, because we weren't in Phuoc Toi province. We were in Ben Hoa province, and I had no idea that when 3 Battalion arrived that they were sort of, in action quite literally after hanging their hats up in their tents. We knew things were happening, but had no idea of the intensity of it.
When did it come to your attention that, the major events of Tet? When did they start coming to your attention?
Not until much later, really, and in the sort of scale, not until I was well and truly back here in Australia. really. Yeah, it was. I mean, got back to Nui Dat because he had access to television. But by that time, the main thrust of the Tet offensive was over, and they were having what they called the second Tet, or mini Tet, was happening around about April, May, June, or somewhere like that. I can't quite remember. And you started to get sort of retrospective vision of what had occurred in Way, but not much. Not much. It wasn't until that my memory serves me. It wasn't until coming back here to Australia and then sort of finding out a lot more, also about the military aspects of it, but also the political ramifications and things like that. I know we did hear, which caused a bit of a flutter, that Australian journalists have been killed in Cholong. I don't know where and how we heard that, but that seemed to be somehow serious. That some journalists had been killed, and no Australians. But the whole idea of neighbourhoods of Vietnamese residents in Way being sort of laid waste by the North Vietnamese didn't sort of come out. I don't know how it came out, and also the equivalent laying of waste, by American armoured columns and jets, raining all sorts of destruction on people.
Do you think, in retrospect now, that the Tet Offensive was designed to start a popular uprising, apart from its military goals?
Oh yes, and this is the great, I suppose, tactical disaster for the North Vietnamese. I mean, it really set them back years. I have no doubt about that. In terms of military infrastructure, logistic support, and this, that, and the other, but set them up to win the war. In terms of the political change, one day you have the Tet Offensive, and up until that point, that the whole expedition into South Vietnam has almost, I won't say universal, but has significant popular support in the United States. It has significant popular support here in Australia. And, the Russians aren't really jumping up and down about it too much because they're too busy invading Prague at the same time. The British have their anti-war protests, but after the Tet Offensive, that's, it's changed almost overnight. And I sort of find that paradigm shift, was really quite rapid, and you can only put that down. As I said earlier, that iconic photograph of that Vietnamese police officer shooting that VC in the street, I think, is sort of interesting. Did that change the nation's attitude to what's happening? And I think, added to that the American embassy was occupied, and I don't know, maybe it was a good thing that there wasn't a popular uprising. I mean, if there had been a popular uprising, Lord knows what would have been happening with sort of a fracturing, another refracturing within a civil war setup. I've got no idea.
Do you think that a lot of the people didn't, when we say popular uprising, was it the scale of destruction that we're talking about here? That I understand some villages had accommodations, agreements between ARVN and certain other units?
I can't say, I don't know. But when you think about that, the major destruction occurred in the cities. It didn't appear to occur at the village level. That's as far as I read it. So it was essentially the city folk, the bourgeoisie, who had more to lose than the average peasant had to lose. It was certainly city-centric in that regard. But I can't say. It's hard to know what accommodations and machinations sort of go on at that particular level.
Were you at any time a religious person in any way whatsoever?
As a child?
Well, I suppose getting closer to the Vietnam period.
No, not at all.
While you were there, what sustained you? I mean, what were the factors involved? Kept you mentally sane?
My military training. The whole idea that it was a finite time in country. The appreciation that alcohol would be very much my own self-destructive mechanism, and I had the opportunity to take on another intoxicant instead of. Yeah, that's about it.
Do you think that if you didn't stay, I mean, if it was an indefinite period, could you have lasted?
No, not at all. I mean, how can you sustain yourself in a country that has no front lines, has no rears, and things like that? It's very, very difficult indeed. There's nothing to advance on. You take over a town. I mean, these cordon and searches are an excellent example. You go and you cordon and search. You rip people out of bed. You process them. You're there for 14 hours or whatever have you. At the end of 14 hours, you leave. What's changed? The village is still there. The only thing that may have changed is, depending on how it was done, whether the level of animosity or resistance either increases or maybe stays the same. It's hard to say. But if it had been an indefinite, as in, say, World War II, I think, you would have had some, quite severe, quite changes in outcomes. Absolutely.
Can you tell me what you did in your last 2 months of Vietnam?
Not with any great accuracy, really. I was at TAC headquarters. I was doing shifts at night on radio duty there, and I was preparing to come home. It was a bit like holding your breath in certain ways, because I knew once you got to 31 or 29 in a wakey, you couldn't go outside the wire again. That was it. So the last 2 months for me, in terms of being a functioning soldier or anything, was essentially a non-event. Just went through the motions. I was physically tired. I'd lost. It wasn't until I came back to Australia that I realised that I was down to, in the old currency, about 9.5 stone in weight at the time, and it was just the allowing your guard down to increase your level of expectation of going home, and just increasing it just a gram each day until you sort of, now I'm under 30, now I can really sort of let go here a little bit, and then down to 15, and by gee, everybody else has got longer to go than me, sort of thing, and then it's an awakey, and it's just there, and it's you leave your bed space, one cot military, one sleeping bag, not sleeping bag, one mosquito net, bit of artillery shell, a case furniture behind, one chair's millionaire, pack your gear, hand your rifle in, get rid of any excess. How ordinary and everyday, getting rid of accessing ammunition, handing in your hand grenades. Strange, isn't it? And then going out to the Q store, getting all your webbing written off, and then you got a couple of shiny new ribbons, and it's waiting for the Wallaby flight next morning to take you down to Saigon, and that was about it. And I never met my replacement. As I said, it was that sort of rotation. My replacement was probably arriving on the very flight that I was taking off. And we got picked up in a Land Rover, open top Land Rover, which was de rigueur for the for Vietnam, and taken down to Lushcombe Airfield and waited for the Caribou to come in. It was bang on time. Got on, thinking, hope it doesn't crash, hope it doesn't get shot down out of the sky or anything like that, and then down to Saigon to catch the flight out. Yeah, and that was about it. And knowing that I was leaving something behind me where a significant event had taken place, but I was not prepared at that stage to try and sort of sort those events out. I was not quite capable of sorting those events out, but I did know that those events had taken. I did know that change had occurred, profound change in me. I knew that by the time of my enlistment was up, I was going to be out of the army. Not too sure exactly what I was going to do, and that I was changed. Yeah, and I think for the better. So I was relatively optimistic about that, but I hadn't sort of shifted the contextual things, and I really hadn't come to grips with some of the contents. And I go back to that sort of thing, Fire Support Base Anderson. Here's a bloke you've known since recruit training, is killed on the spot, and nobody's sort of made much mention about that ever. And yet he gets memorialised now, but at the time there was very little. And one of the things that hit me about that, when I was thinking about it, he was one of the very few diggers who was married. His wife's name was Helen, and Jim came from Buxton. And I thought about, but there was never any sort of, discussion about that.
What do you think of these guys who went back for 3-4 tours in Vietnam?
I knew one that went for 2, medic. What can I say? I don't know. Look, it's pretty. So yeah, if you're hooked into it, I suppose it's a bit like taking a drug. You never quite get the same degree of satisfaction, but you can't give it up. I can't tell you. Look, for blokes. No, I don't have any real thoughts on that.
So it must have been a great relief when you were on that plane looking out the window.
No, it wasn't actually. The great relief occurred in 2 stages and a letdown. I think it was November 28th, 1968. And got on the plane. And look, I can't, you see, and this is where my memory's patchy. I can't remember who I was with from the unit. I've got no idea, actually. But, a few beers and, that sort of, banter and bonhomie, and then periods of quietness, and the plane keeps droning on and droning on. But where the first surge of relief came is that I was going to say the aircraft commander, the pilot, mentioned that we'd just crossed Darwin, and there was such a wave of release and relief within the plane, a real sense that we've crossed a line. And in that year in Sydney, there were bushfires in the Blue Mountains. It was sort of a bit symbolic, actually, because here we are at 30-odd thousand feet heading into Sydney, and here's this fire sort of lighting the path, pointing us down the coast to Mascot Airport. And then there was and it was sort of interesting how the silence sort of seeped through the plane again, and as we circled and came into Mascot, and we hit the tarmac, and there was such a cheer inside the plane, palpable relief and release of this. And it wasn't, what I sort of found interesting, it wasn't from where I was sitting, it wasn't blokes sort of turning around to other blokes and giving a slap on the back or shaking hands. It was their own individual cheers sort of individually sent up through the roof of the aeroplane and still cheering, and the door opened up and this bastard arrived in a dust coat and a fly spray and started spraying the inside of the plane, and that was the letdown. We didn't even get enough chance to cheer properly, rage against that. But it was a wonderful, spontaneous and individually shared moment on the plane. And then taxied into the, obviously in the tarmac. It was a hot night in Sydney. You smell the bushfire in the air. Isn't that interesting, from smelling fish heads and fish sauce and mangroves and Christ knows what else, whatever your Vietnam really was in an olfactory sense. And then coming down, we were all processed into races, lines, and started going through customs. And the procedure, you go through the customs, you change currency, or you will be issued with currency. Some people would fly off to another destinations. I'd actually decided to stay in Sydney that night because I wanted to catch the train. I wanted to savour the train journey next day. And then as we're sort of going through, it dawned on me, as I think it probably dawned on other people, because as people were going through customs and disappearing the other side, there was no gathering on the other side. They were going into their various departure lounges. And that really hit home to me, that I could see Blue Peasley he came from Dubbo. I could see him, say, 10 customs races down that way, sort of heading through and realising that was it. And when I went through customs and I turned around, he wasn't there. Yeah, quite odd.
So there was no final hug, farewell?
No, it's just gone.
Big anticlimax.
It was, and interestingly enough, I have got no memory of what I did next. I have absolutely no memory whatsoever. Maybe I got pissed rotten drunk. I really don't know. But I have no memory. And we would have got through customs at about 11 o'clock at night.
Was anyone waiting for you?
No, they were down here in Melbourne. There's nobody waiting for me. And I have no memory of where I spent that night. I have partial memory of catching the train that following night to come down to Melbourne. And I remember arriving at Spencer Street Railway Station, and that the two mixtures on my mother's face of joy of sort of having me back home, but saying you don't look well, which I didn't. I was quite badly underweight at that time, and probably looked a bit yellowish and that sort of thing, and then we went to the Middle Park Hotel for a counter lunch, and then very shortly after that was it.
That's incredibly surreal, isn't it? Coming from Vietnam for 12 months.
It was, and what I do find, maybe I should go and have a hypnotherapist, because I'd really like to know what happened that night. But I've got no memory of it whatsoever. I guess there was a certain cathartic release, and at the same time a bit of self-protection mechanisms sort of come into play at the same time. But no memory of it whatsoever.
So how did you find yourself readjusting to Australian society?
It'd probably be interesting asking somebody who knew me at the time. One of the first things I did when I came back here is I bought a rifle. A 303.270. What a gun. What a rifle. Why did I buy that? I don't know. But I know that I went and bought a rifle. I know that I found it. I had an anticipation or an expectation of on the first day that I arrived, or the second day I arrived in Vietnam, I had a very definable moment where I switched on. I was waiting for that definable moment upon return to switch off. It wasn't happening. It was elusive. I was not switching off. I expected it to be a switch off, and it just didn't occur. I found sort of things strange that the blokes that I had went to school with, their lives and their existences when I sort of met them were very mundane. And what they considered the stresses and ordinary everydays of their particular life, which, I in no way make criticism, it's observation. There was no meeting point whatsoever. I mean, just eating with one of these P38 can spanners out of a ration tin, and they're using knives and forks. It was just a completely dislocating experience, and it became very evident to me that I was not comfortable sleeping in a bed. And I'd get out of bed and sleep on the floor, and I found that, much more, don't say comfortable, but satisfying. And as they say in the literature, it was not a good idea to sort of come up behind me and tap me on the shoulder or anything like that, or for extraneous noises to occur. It was a bit edgy in that regard. And then I met up with a bloke who I'd met previously called Ray Leishman. And Ray was a really nice bloke, and he was a trained psychiatric nurse. And we started talking a little bit, and I thought, oh well. So I rocked up to Larundel Hospital in '69, and got a job as a ward assistant. And then I got a job. Then I did my student nurse training there, and very quickly I realised I'd sort of found a niche, and part of that niche was self-protective. Being in amongst the lunatics, you really didn't stand out if you're a little bit mad. Right? It was a very sensible strategy, and I got paid for this, and I could go home, after work and things like that. It gave me money in my pocket, but then gave me a career interest. I became quite fascinated with what constituted the human psychic condition and the interaction between environment, psychosocial aspects, biology. I became fascinated. I loved anatomy and physiology. I became very interested in that, and I became very good at my job, even though at times a bit reckless, especially with a bit of piss on board, and things like that. But it started to come back to me, be fed back to me, that I was actually good at what I was doing. And so I finished my training there and graduated, a good graduation, and made probably one of the more significant mistakes in my life. Then I got married to the wrong woman, or maybe the right woman, it's hard to know. But it was also during my time at Larundel that I became involved with the anti-war movement. My wife-to-be at the time had been a student at La Trobe University, which was a bit of a hotbed with the Students for Democratic Society. We lived in a sort of a Leonard Cohen-soaked sort of little terrace house in North Carlton there in Neal Street, and there was grog, there was dope, and there was sex, and there was also the network for draft dodgers to be sort of moved through. So it was really quite exciting. What did start to disturb me a little bit when people, and I guess it's one of the hazards of being a sort of a pseudo-revolutionary, is that in order to make your point, what do is nobody's not taking any notice of you. And then somebody's thinking it might have been a good idea to put a bomb in the shrine. Well, you see, that I couldn't go in, I was not the person to talk to, about that.
Someone suggested.
Yeah, though it was not going to happen. I mean, where do you get a bomb in 1969, you know? And things, but it was discussed because the shrine was seen as some edifice to sort of, you know, military imperialism. I had never seen it in that regard. And that was my family sort of history. And one of my distant relatives used to be the regular bugler on Anzac Day, playing the last post and reveille at the shrine. And when I started hearing things like that, and then things started to get a bit iffy, you know, in terms of those sorts of human relations, things like that. At one stage in that, I was quite pleased for people to know, you know, that I'd served in Vietnam, and then it became less and less politic to sort of let people know that.
Why is that?
Because you became the object of their anger and their scorn.
How so?
Because you were seen as the instrument of government policy. You were being told straight to your face it was a mistake, it was a civil war. You know, as far as I'm concerned, I'd already worked that out through bitter experience, not as a sort of a first year politics at La Trobe University exercise. You know.
I went to.
Well, yeah,
I did politics.
yeah, but and it'd be a good idea that I read Sartre, and being spoken to, you know, and again, it's like going back where my schoolmates. I mean, the paradigms that we were operating, there was, you know, it was really sheared to, you know, in one direction.
So when you came back, you became vigorously anti-war.
When I came back, two things had occurred to me by the time I'd finished. I had become a humanitarian, not a pacifist. I would still take up arms, you know, to defend myself and my country, and you know that I've got no problems about that. But essentially, a humanitarian, and the other was a budding ecologist. Because the other thing that I had noticed during a couple of sojourns in Vietnam was to go into country which had been bombed and defoliated, and it shocked me to the core. It had a profound... So I sort of felt a little bit emotional actually during this whole exercise. I couldn't believe... I went into one place, I think it was on the Firestone Trail, which had been cleared with these huge bulldozers and chained, and then it had been defoliated, and then it had been napalmed, and then it had been bombed. You know, and they're making war on the land. It's like the Romans when they sacked Carthage, you know. And I can remember going there, and I couldn't hear a thing. It's like that racial Carson thing, with no birds singing. There were certainly no birds singing on the Firestone Trail. There weren't ants there either. And Vietnam is a country alive with crawling things, and there were no ants. And I found this profoundly shocking. Yeah. And so I had these were two things that that had in fact crystallised in me upon my arrival back in Australia, and. Then, so it sort of put me, you know, I had the right sort of credentials in terms of orientation, but the wrong sort of experience for these students there, because I was the instrument, you know, of government policy and, you know, blah blah blah, and they did tend to go on a little bit about it, and as I said, you know, making daft statements about, you know, putting a bomb in the shrine or some shit like that.
What about personal insult?
Got personal insults, yeah.
What sort of insults were these?
Oh, it was well, look, you know, the cliches.
Such as?
You know, killing women and children, you know, those, you know, that sort of cliche. But the one I really didn't like, was the whole idea that essentially I was profoundly stupid. How could you have done this? You know, didn't you know? Weren't you aware? Well, interestingly enough, in 1966, very few people in this country were aware of anything in that regard. And then from the political sense, as I said, it was a landslide all the way with LBJ. You know, and all that. But I can remember I got into a fight with a bloke who actually became quite a mover and shaker in the education union. It was quite unpleasant, actually. But there was a bit of that. But look, that sort of, I would say, died away as I sort of removed myself, from that, and got on with my work, got married, and interesting, that sort of persecution, or accusation, continued through that particular marriage.
The only problem is we've only got like literally a minute left or less.
That's it.
So I'd like to just do. I'm just
Yeah.
very sorry. We've done 10 tapes,
Yeah.
today, so we've actually gone over,
Right.
and we could still go.
Right.
But is there something you'd like to say just to round off your thing? You've got about 30 seconds.
I think the great thing about being older is that the uncomfortable is more comfortable. How's that?
You've come to appreciate things.
Yes. And that you've given the choice for changing certain things. I would if I could, but I can't. But I think for what I am as an individual now, I think it's a pretty reasonable outcome considering the slings and arrows. And I was a volunteer. and I've got to take responsibility for that, which I do. And this is also reflected in my job at the present. I work with great people. We do a great job, and we have a lot of mutual regard and respect for our clinical and professional capabilities.